Welcome to the Sustainable Development of Our Planet side event that is organized by the Geo-Human Planet Initiative. My name is Martino Pesaresi. I'm the chair of the initiative. And I will provide you a brief introduction of what we do in this initiative. And then we'll have two set of talks. The first talks will be about new baseline data. We'll have Timothy Trainer from the US Census Bureau and UNGGIM that is talking about the need of Earth observation for achieving the monitoring on the implementation of SDGs. And then we'll have myself talking about the global dynamics of built-up surfaces, and Alan Belworth talking about the global dynamics of water surfaces, and Christopher Albrecht that will talk about Earth observation contributing to the agenda on sustainable urban development. After this first set of talks, we'll have a break of a few minutes, and then we have another set of talks about data science for policies that will be about the role of GEO for translating Earth observation data records in policy measurements from Robert Chen. And then Paolo Veneri from OECD talking about data definition and tools to support policy analysis. And then Tom Fitzwater talk about Earth observation data for estimation, population distribution, and improving census operation. And finally, Luis Distra that will entertain everybody about global spatial baseline data supporting standardization and the global people-based definition of cities and settlement. So this is the program of the event. Thank you very much for coming, and it's my pleasure to introduce you to the Human Planet Initiative. The initiative is it's a new initiative in the GEO working program, and it's strategic, supporting the strategic working plan for the 2016-2025. The aim of the initiative is to support novel evidence-based assessment of the human presence on the planet Earth. So you see the aim is quite broad, but the idea is that, of course, we leverage on advanced Earth observation technology and geospatial data analytics for improving our awareness of how humans are colonized, let's say, taking and settling in our planet. So the idea is that there is a information knowledge gap, and new technologies, new data science efforts can try to contribute to fill some of those gaps. So that's the, let's say, the general part. Then let's say there is also a mission statement from the Human Planet Initiative, the fact that new, open, and consistent data are needed for assessing human impact on the planet. So the fact that there is a need of new data, there is a need of new knowledge in order to translate this new data in actionable information. A big effort of the initiative is to try to understand how new data can be translated in metrics that are actionable, so that can try to drive the actions, so the decision of decision makers. And then the fact is that despite the fact it's a new initiative, we count more than 150 individual scientists and policymakers that are, let's say, in the partnership. They belong to 85 different organizations, including academies, international stakeholders, governmental bodies, and private sector. So that's the fact about the Human Planet. This is the, let's say, the log of the core partners. And you have a steering committee. You see there are, let's say, several established scientists included there. You can also understand they come from different fields. They are not all remote sensing experts, but they come from different fields of science, and also there are several, let's say, belonging to policy-making bodies. We have a set of expert groups set inside the human planet. The first forum was a few weeks ago in Netherlands, and those expert groups were discussed and, let's say, defined more clearly. This is the list. You see from the list that, again, it's very broad, the scope of the initiative. That's maybe the interest, but maybe also a weak point. But the point is that you see there are groups talking about how to use this data for global harmonized definition of citizen settlement, global settlement and disaster risk reduction, global urban climate and mitigation planning, global updated historical baseline data of built-up areas, high-resolution age-structured population maps, global settlement infrastructure and population data intercomparison. And then, so this is, let's say, a more data-driven block of expert groups. And then we have about more application on population grids, global future population grids, global urban metabolism, urbanization dynamics in China, in the Belt and Road region, capacity building and initiative, poverty mapping. So that's the list of the expert groups that were approved in the last forum. Let's say, if you are interested to join us, please send me an email. That's my email address, and more information available from this website. That's the short introduction to the Human Planet Initiative. Thank you very much. So, you are moderating this. So, I see. Yes.
Hello, everyone. I'm Bob Chen from Columbia University, and I represent the ICSU World Data System here at Geo. Yeah, to join Martino, welcome to the session. Also, people, I guess, might be online watching this. If you were here in the room this morning, you got bombarded by many short talks, quite interesting, but you know, there wasn't a whole lot of time to get into depth. So we have a slightly different strategy, maybe the other extreme. As Martino already said, we have 2 sets of 4 papers, so in an hour and a half for 4 papers. So, you know, hopefully each of our speakers will go like maybe 15 minutes. We'll then have 5 minutes, say, for discussion and immediate questions, and that should still, keep your fingers crossed, leave some time for general discussion with the whole panel. So hopefully that will, you know, let us get a little bit deeper into some of these interesting issues, and you'll be able to stay awake all afternoon. Well, you've already heard what the topics are, so I will introduce our first speaker, whom, if you've been at other sessions, you've seen him before, Tim Traynor from the Bureau of the Census and also the UN Global Geospatial Group of Experts on Global Geospatial Information Management, GGIM. So, Tim, please. Let's see if we can get this. Which one is it?
I'll go.
Great.
Thanks.
I'll give you a warning with like 2 minutes or so.
That's great. Thanks. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for the opportunity. Thank you, Bob and Martino. So when Martino contacted me, he said, you know, we'd like to hear a UN GGIM perspective. At the UN Committee of Experts on Global Geospatial Information Management was formed up in 2011. And I co-chair, along with China and the Netherlands, that body at the moment. And it's made up of, it's an intergovernmental body, so all the countries have an opportunity to participate in that session. So the question is, do we need Earth observations for achieving and monitoring the implementation of the SDGs? The SDGs came onto the scene 2 years ago. They're giving us all, I think, a purpose for being. Many of us are working in research and in specific topics, and I think the SDGs are helping us find a reason for pushing a different agenda forward. So I'm offering a UNGGIM perspective, and I'm going to try to do this in a very general way. So I hope you're not too disappointed in that aspect of it. I'm not going to talk a lot about the UNGGIM, but I just do want to give you some context. It's a global approach. I think that this was formed up years ago because there was a recognition on the need for geospatial information for different countries, particularly for developing countries. There was also a need for geospatial information for regional and global approaches in a variety of different UN functions, and the UN agencies respond to those kinds of challenges. Over time, since 2011, we've evolved into having a governance, having an organization. It's working very well. It's very efficient. And we've picked on certain kinds of topics to pursue that we hope advance the nature of the geospatial information in the world. So if you're thinking about talking to a leader in any country, the goal is to say to that leader, this is what geospatial is, this is why it's important to your country, to your region, and to the globe as a whole. And this is what you can do to try to help make that more possible. Put it as a priority, invest in it, whatever the options are available to those countries. So when the UNGGIM formed up, we started to focus in on certain kinds of topics. This is just a selection of some of the things we're working on. We have working groups and expert groups that are working together. But we wanted to identify what some of the gaps were. We wanted to be sure that there was an approach for global decision-making. We wanted to be sure that governments were involved in this process, because this is what it's about in terms of offering them an opportunity to be involved. We looked at policy and legal frameworks. They basically are absent from a global perspective, and even from a national perspective, there's not a lot of activity happening in the legal arena for geospatial information, so we have a group looking at those topics, and I think that's going to be increasingly important for the future. For the developing countries, global capacity development, so how do we ensure that folks are able to stand up these kinds of challenges and tasks? And then as issues come up, events, and we're all aware of different kinds of events, how can we respond to that in a meaningful way? So some of the agenda topics, we looked at a global geodetic reference frame. For example, Fiji was the country that put that on the agenda to say, as the seas are rising, how do we assume that we've got good location data to be sure that we can respond to things. Having fundamental global data sets, so this is different types of data themes. Institutional arrangements, that's how does a developing country stand up an organization to be able to address these kinds of topics. Standards, technical issues, they go without saying. Integration is a continuing challenge for us, and we have efforts working toward addressing those integration topics. Land administration, if you look at the world as a whole, the belief is that 70% of the land area is without meaningful land administration. That's a problem, so how do we address those kinds of things? And on and on and on. So let's move on to the next one. Okay, so data types for SDG success. I've looked at this from a very simplistic way. Geography and geospatial data, they go hand in hand. Statistical data, you know that the statisticians are the ones that came up with the indicators for the SDGs, and I can assure you that those statisticians are not geospatial scientists, so that's something that we can contribute to in that process. And then, of course, Earth observation data, you know, in a sense, it's a subset of geospatial information, but what does it give us? And so, minimally, if you look at it, it provides a picture, and that picture on its own merit has value when you look at the results of that kind of data. It gives geographic perspective. It also allows us to look at different conditions and characteristics. So you can get some meaningful information just by looking at that image. If you take it one step further, then you can derive data from that image. You can make your road network. You can, determine some boundaries of some kinds of activity that are going on the ground, and on and on and on. So that's greater value that you're adding to that process. What's interesting, though, and this is also true with the SDGs, this is not a one-time event. So how frequently do we need to keep certain data types up to date? How often do we have to refresh that data so that it's giving us the kind of answers to the questions that we're asking? And then, of course, there's the relationship between the different content elements. Taking it to the next level, and there's some of this work going on today, but there's certainly opportunity to do a lot more in this arena, starting to model what the data should tell us as a result. So can we do some predictive modeling as a result of the information that we see today? So some examples of data files, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, but streets and roads, that you can get from Earth observation data. You can also collect it in many other different ways, and we know the history of that data collection. Legal, statistical, and administrative area boundaries, that's information you're probably not going to get from an image. So that's coming from some other source. And in some cases, those sources are very precise. And in other cases, those sources are horribly inaccurate. Inaccurate? Well, maybe not. Maybe they're accurate, but they're not positionally accurate. So those are the kinds of bits of information that one needs to understand and know. Rivers, lakes, flood zones, on and on and on. These kinds of things can be derived from looking at those images. And, of course, just some specific thematic applications. I like this picture for the left corner, the left bottom corner. In my space, we're interested in collecting information about people. And the way we do that is we find out where they live. We're not interested in John Doe. We're interested in where John Doe lives. And then we get the information about the people that live in that household. And so then we aggregate that up to higher levels. If you look at that picture in the bottom left, you've got a combination of, you've got Earth observation data, you've got boundaries that were either offered by the local government or delineated by somebody because of criteria. You've got instances of other kinds of geospatial information like, say, for example, the position of the household. And if you look at the SDGs, some of those SDGs actually call for knowing that level of detail. And I can assure you that globally that doesn't exist. It does exist in a few countries, but it doesn't exist in most. So that's the kind of challenge I think we have before us. You can use Earth observation data to determine where the locations of those buildings are, though. And we're doing that here at the Census Bureau at the moment. So here's examples of statistical files or statistical data. And I'm just trying to show some variability, that's all. So you can see some examples of that. Numbers. Numbers are important. But without context, it doesn't really help. So, all of a sudden, it now starts to give you meaning. It starts to, give you some semblance of what those numbers stand for. And so that's part of how the integration of these ideas and these data points become more meaningful to us. So statistical information on its own, if you're a statistician, you're in heaven. If you're not a statistician, you may not be in heaven. And so if you look at this example, for example, this is not georeferenced data. This is just numbers. Now, the question is, if you look at what's happening within the SDG world on the statistical side, there's a lot of interest and emphasis on disaggregating data. And what are they going to disaggregate the data to? Well, at some point, it's going to be disaggregated to location information. So that's a step. That's a means to an end. It's part of the process. Geocode. How do we make sense of that? We tie the data to the land, and we do that through some kind of geographic code. And that's the way that works. It's pretty simplistic conceptually. It's really difficult to implement. And so it's something that those of us in this space do on a day-by-day basis. Geography adds value, so it helps us understand the story of the data we're working with. It generates innumerable hypotheses. It reveals patterns, relationships, and trends not obvious in a statistical table. And it provides bounds and simplifies complex and dense information. Keep your eye on the slide. Well, Earth observation data adds value. So it basically does similar kinds of things, but in a different context, in a different way. So my point is that in answer to the question, is Earth observation data valuable to the efforts going on with the SDGs? It most certainly is. Now the question is, how can we explore that? And Bob mentioned the sessions that we had this morning, and there was a lot of questions, a lot of good questions, and a lot of information that was coming at us, and a lot of science, and a lot of solutions, potential solutions to some really complex problems. So if you think about the integration or the notion of even tools like GIS, you can begin answering the questions once you have some of that basic data put together and available to us. So Earth observation data adds value. It provides a unique vantage point, a view from above. I mean, right now we all look at Google Maps and we're sitting above looking down. And, we're all teased by turning on the imagery as well. That's always a fun thing to do. But that's not normally the way we've looked at, we've thought about and processed that information. Earth observation data provides massive geographic coverage so that you can see lots of territory, lots of area on the ground. And it has lots of different varied applications. This is just a very small sample. You know this space much better than I do, but you can see the diversity. You can begin to see the diversity because it's far more diverse than I'm stating here. So now we move on to the SDGs, and we've seen this little picture before. But now we're really trying to answer some tough questions. How do we get people, economies, environments on a reasonable playing field so that we're all moving in a positive direction for our futures? That's really what it's about. And so here you can see I'm really focusing in on the center with the three circles, the environment, we've got society, and we've got economy. It's the intersection of those things. Earth observation data is clearly part of this process. And you can see the role of geocoding, how we link these things together through the notion of coding one to another. So those linkages are really critical as we go forward. Once again, this is a diagram that GGIM has put together talking about the data ecosystem, a different approach or slightly modified approach to things. Look at the bottom tier, imagery, water, ocean, land cover, all kinds of things. That's Earth observation data that's sitting there. You have data from statistical agencies. You have data from national geospatial organizations. And then you have, on the far right, what I would call the chaotic data, the stuff that's a little bit more difficult to work with, and we have to learn more about how to engage with that kind of data. So this morning we talked about goals 6, 11, and 14. This is just an indication of how we bring this data together and how we make sense out of it. SDGs are geospatial, and they're statistical, and they require collaboration. They're multi-stakeholder. That's why we're all here today making this work for us for the future. So when we look at data initiatives, for example, for Goal 11, if we have global data sets, we should start there. We shouldn't start at a country level and build it up if it already exists for the globe, and it's good enough. And that's a big question. Is it good enough? Is the level of data we have good enough? That's an important question. We had a comment this morning of how do you convince a country, because they're the ones in an SDG environment that have to support and buy in and use it as part of their process. How do you convince them to do that? Well, that's where, for example, UNGGIM can help. That's not a promise, but that's an offer of help, because we can engage with people to explain that to them. And then you can look at urban scale data sets using imagery and local data. You can apply the methodologies to monitor change over time, because that's what we're trying to do. We heard examples this morning about challenges with that. And then we want to look at comparing those indicators across different subnational levels. So for those of us who are involved in SDGs at a national level, cities and lower levels of government are wanting to participate. They want to know what their situation is relative to others. That's how it's beginning to happen. It's happening without anybody putting a call out for it, but they want to know. So with that, I'll end. Thank you.
So we do have time for a question or two?
Please.
Laura? Oh, sorry. I think you should use this.
Yeah.
I will run to you and help you. Thank you. Hi, Tim. Just a quick question. If you have also seen, Laura Delgado Lopez with Harris. If you have also seen a request or an interest in UNGGIM providing best practices in how each country's addresses those questions. Like in trying to see, is the data set we have good enough, could UNGGIM help provide some guidelines for that?
Yeah, so right now, as we speak, there are a number of countries that are meeting together to look at tools and methodologies that might be useful, that could actually be transportable and used by others. So we're beginning that process right now to help give them that capability. And I think that that's going well at the moment, but it's got a ways to go. So we are working on that as a work item.
Question? Okay, well, Kim-
Might be a question to Tim.
Oh, okay.
Before.
I love his glasses, but
Yeah. Okay, the question is, do you think data, just special data about settlements, human settlements, has a special, let's say, strategic interest respect to the fact to link people with the place, then with the name, and then with the geocoding, for example, respect to other kind of geoinformation data? So it's a question mark. Do you think, because we believe that there is a strategic interest to invest in that. So I would like to understand if you share this or you have another point of view. Or what.
yeah. So at one level, knowing where people are and knowing what happens to them is important. So in the United States, for example, people move on average of 12 times, over the course of time. So that's a data point that we have. Or I shouldn't say it that way. Sorry, I got it wrong. 12% of the population move every year. That's what I really wanted to say. 12% of the population move every year. That's less than 12 times. But that's still quite a high number for as far as I'm concerned. So is it and where are they moving to, and what's driving them to move to where they go? So that's one level. Another level is you want to understand at the other extreme, where you have migrations of people moving for a variety of reasons, and they're moving into a location. How do you know that they're moving? How do you know where they're moving to? How do you know the conditions upon which they're moving to as well? So that you have all these factors. Can you geocode those folks? The answer to the question is you can, but not easily. It's possible to do, but so I think there's value. To answer the question that Martino asks, there's absolute value in knowing the movement of people, the migration of people, where they're going from and where they're going to. That's absolutely critical, I think, as we try to, looking at the SDGs, respond to their needs.
Okay, well, I think we need to move on. 15 minutes goes faster than you think, so
Yes.
Martino, you are next. And I'll crack the whip on you.
Yes. What is it? This. Yes. So this is my talk today. It's about global dynamics of built-up surfaces. I will try to hang on with the speech of Tim, saying that here we observe people, but through the fact that they live physical things like houses with roof on the ground, and this is the observable things we account from remote sensing data. In particular, this is the physical things we account with open and free remote sensing data where we cannot see people, we cannot see the shadow of people that maybe we can observe at 20 centimeter resolution data. We have data at 20, 30 meter resolution, so we see houses. And what I will tell you now is, let's say, how we were trying to solve the problem to collect all the roofed house of the world using open and free data, and to make this useful for mapping the human settlements and the people living there. All this was done let's say, in a set of activities that we call Global Human Settlement Layer, fostered by the European Commission Joint Research Center together with the international partnership that is listed here, so the Geo-Human Planet Initiative. The schema here basically summarizes what we did. Basically what we did is that we put together two main sources of data. We missed one, but let's say two main, that is the satellite imageries and census data. From satellite imageries, we were extracting, let's say, physical characteristics. So, for example, built-up areas. For us, built-up areas are areas where you see at least one building, so roofed structure above surface of the ground. This is our definition of buildings. Okay, so we collect all the buildings of the globe, and then we integrate this with green areas and night lights coming from other sensors. But the basic point is that, let's say, we try to solve the problem of collecting with decrametric sensor. So Landsat historical sensor, and then next Copernicus data, the presence, the human presence on the globe, and the human presence is formalized as the presence of buildings. That's the simplification. We know there are a lot of people that go around without buildings in their shelter. They live in places where, let's say, building is not needed or is not in the cultural framework. But let's say this is assumption, because the assumption was that we are looking for something that is observable in an objective way. That was the attempt, I'd say. The assumption that are behind the global human settlement layer activities is that, as I said before, we were trying to operate in an open and free data and methods access policy. So despite the fact that maybe some information is more efficiently collected using specific sensors or specific methods, if those sensors and methods are not open and free, for us were less interesting, because the aim was to contribute to international framework. So the idea was to have open and free methods that then we can openly share with international partners or organizations. And then the second, let's say, set of statements, it's also important. We were, let's say, investing quite a lot in automatic data classification methods, but not just because we are fan of automatic or robots or things like that. The point is that we think that if you want to be reproducible, scientifically defendable, fine-scale, synoptic, complete, and bound planetary sites, and cost-effective, you must include large part of automatic data mining. Otherwise, you cannot do that. That was the assumption. So if you do the things by hand, you will never be able to redo the same again. And if you do that at the global side, accept that you need hundreds of years or thousands of people doing, manual tasks. But then again, you will not be able to redo that again consistently, and repeatability. It's important. I mean, if you want to convince people to use your new data, we think that a good point would be that to say to the person, to the policymakers, for example, you can redo that with an open and free tool and open and free data. So let's say you can demonstrate again. That's also the power of science. I mean, if you don't trust, you can do the experiment at home and you will get the same results. This is working if you work in an open and free environment. If you have a secret receipt or ingredients that nobody else has in your model, then the things become more difficult to convince people to use that new data. Then the third point is also important. We think that if you lower down the cost of information production because you have automatic process behind, then you facilitate information sharing and multilateral democratization of the information production and collective knowledge building. Why that? Because, I mean, it's a bit cynical, but if you spend a lot of money to build your information, then you are a bit less inclined to share this. That's the idea. If the information is low cost, then the idea is that we power the sharing and the possibility of compare different things. Okay, so we have enhanced and let's say improved techniques to dig inside the data. These new techniques, new data mining techniques can enhance the perception of the reality you may have. This is, for example, the urban areas, as they are called in Mary's globe cover 300-meter resolution product. We are in Chicago area. This is the information as it is collected from the 300-meter sensors. So what we did basically is to use this information as a training set for machines that they were trained, they were learning out of that what we mean for urban areas, built-up areas, and we were inputting instead a much higher resolution, for example, 30-meter resolution data. It is what you get. So basically, you use this as a learning set, so the machine will start to train to understand what is the relationship between data records and high-level semantics categories like urban areas. And then they produce this output. So this is, let's say, the most probable let's say, pixels of 30-meter resolution, so let's say 100 times more dense the spatial sampling than the one before, that are reporting about the presence of buildings. Okay, that's interesting. Then another interesting point I would like to make here is that, I mean, there is a lot of talk here also I've seen in those days about data cubes. Actually, we made our data cube for making the job done. And might be interesting to understand that our data cubes are evolutionary data cubes. So they self-learn. And that's might be interesting to notice. For example, here we are in New Delhi, in India. This is, those are the built-up areas that we learned using low-resolution data as example. And then we were classifying all the satellite data records back to 1975, okay, reporting about that. And we organized these in 4 epochs, 75, 90, 2000, 2014. Okay, so this is the information as it is recognized by the machines, taking low-resolution data available at the time. And the experiment was done in 2014, so a few years ago. So those are the built-up areas. Then in 2016, we used this as learning set instead of the low resolution data. We used this, and we classified the radar data. This is Sentinel I data, 10 meter, 20 meter resolution. So you see that we improved a little bit. So some villages that were not discovered by all the machine learning because they were learning from low resolution data are now discovered because we have an improved sensor or because there is an easier link between data characteristics and the presence of the high-level semantic class. So we were discovering more small things. Then we can use this output as a learning set again to reclassify all the Landsat data. This is what we did now. This is the data we will release next year at the World Urban Forum. So I see you a bit confused, but the point is that our data cube are not just data cube in the space-temporal domain. There is also a semantic level. And the fact that the cube are learning each other and there are information flows, and we have another axis, that is the information refinement axis. This is, I think, something important to understand also from the technological point of view. If you want to solve similar problems, so global level with classes that are not easy to find in the data features, and they are largely contradictory as the data records are in the long time domain, you have to handle such kind of system according to our opinion. So let's say data cube that are also self-learning and let's say, filled by intelligence, artificial intelligence that is able to understand automatically if there are links between data and at the different scale, at different level. Okay, so if you do all that, so you build, let's say, a self-learning data cube, you deploy the artificial intelligence algorithm, and then you can get there. So basically, there, thanks to the collaboration with the CSIN, we were, let's say, downscaling the census data, so amount of people, in the built-up areas. So basically, we are putting people in the buildings through spatial modeling, and this is what you get. Maybe now it's just the dancing of the 40 years development. So I love this picture, but apart from that, I think the message is that you need advanced analytics and spatial data processing technologies to get there. Why that? Because the data is largely heterogeneous, inconsistent. You cannot imagine how much the data is contradicting themselves. So no one census bureau agree with the other census bureau that is close by. There are boundary effects. Nobody agrees on anything. Now I'm a bit let's say, pessimistic, but the point is that if you want to handle global data at the fine scale, more you go fine scale, less you agree on each specific, let's say, square meter of the land surface. And it is a bit paradoxical, but then if you want to handle that, you want to get there, you need advanced spatial analytics tools. That's the message. Then if you do that, then you start to harvest something interesting. This is, for example, a chart that is showing in the two axes. This is the billions of population. This is, we know through census, so we can count people. This is the amount of built-up surfaces we account globally. And then we break down by region. So we have Asia, we have Africa, we have Latin America. You can see that you can claim they increase their built-up area because there is a driver. The driver is the increase of population. So there is a correlation between the increase of population and the increase of built-up areas in those regions. You have two other regions like Europe and North America where they increase the built-up areas, they don't increase so much in population. So it could be arguable to say that the population increase is driving the increase of the surface taken by the cities. Okay. The point is that you can demonstrate this using objective data here and also objective data there. So it would be, let's say, yeah, I close. No, so, thank you. So that's one of the important things you can start to harvest if you do such a system. So objective monitoring of development patterns. It's amazing how good you see the different things there. Another important point is that you can discover new things. For example, those points here are accounted in the UN World Urbanization Prospectus of 2015. We are in China here. So you can say this is the universe as it is recognized by UN bodies. Okay? So they have a list of cities. Those cities are 3 points. If you have the carpet you see there that is collected from remote sensing data, you can start to argue why this it's in the list, not this city, etc. So this kind of reasoning can be done only if you have the complete carpet. If you have just the list, it will be very difficult to understand that you miss one city or you have one city more. So that's one message I would like to provide to this session. Then you can also unveil new perspective of urbanization. For example, we are applying the degree of urbanization model that uses density of population to separate between urban and rural areas. And then we discovered that if you apply this objective way to separate urban versus rural, then you discover that Europe ranks as the highest share of population in rural areas. That was a bit, let's say, astonishing. Then you start to think why and then to find a theory. But it's the why that is important, because you are, let's say, you face an objective output from an objective rule that everybody understands. Then this is clashing with the, let's say, prejudice that we have about people and places. So that's important to know. So new data can, break prejudice. And then new data can support harmonization of indicators. This is maybe a talk of Luis at the end of this session. But the fact is that the baseline, consistent baseline data can support the attempt to make, let's say, harmonized definition and indicators. This is about the global people-based definition of cities and settlements. So all this is full, open, free data and tools. You can download from this data, from this website, the ghsl.grc.ec.Europe.eu, and from the geoportal.org. And yeah, thank you very much for your kind attention. I'm sorry I'm always late.
Remember, we had time for questions, so there's
Yes.
still 3.5 minutes for questions in your allotment. So, questions for Martino?
I've seen the examples where we show that you use Sentinel I as one of the source of information in order to map your built-up areas. And we know how much important radar is in order to solve the misclassifications we can have using only optical data. So where do you stand now with the Sentinel I? I mean, do you, with radar data, let's say in general, but Sentinel I in particular, because we have the time series, so it can really help a lot. I mean, it has been fully integrated in the GHSL yet?
If you go to the website and you click in the Copernicus tag, you will find the latest update of that. But basically, we did a global experiment in December 2016. We were classifying all the landmass with available Sentinel-1 data. The plan is to have the first experiment using Sentinel-2, so optical data at intermediate resolution at the end of this year. So we have just finalized now the prototype before Christmas. We hope to have this. And next year, we have the integrated Sentinel-1, Sentinel-2, and Landsat game. Our way to integrate the data is not at the end of the process, but it is at the beginning. So basically, we use as learning set one of the data, and this is, let's say, helping to converge to a more consistent description of the reality. But let's say, it can be a long discussion, so I'm available to talk more about that. But yeah, if you want an update about Copernicus data, go there and you will find it.
So Martino, this is Miguel Roman from NASA. One thing that I've always been interested in GHSL is because as a starting point, Landsat was used, then it became very popular, and then people start thinking, oh, that's the Landsat product, where what you're clarifying here is that this is a sensor-independent product that synergistically uses multiple sources. The fact that you start with Landsat is just how the project started. And I think that
it's not just like that. There is a fact. The fact is that the Landsat is the only historical records of the chemetric data available for humanity.
Right.
So this will not be replaced. That's impossible. You cannot go back 40 years ago and create a new
bring
sensor.
back Sentinel-1, yeah.
So that's just a fact.
Right.
So it's not just by chance that we start from Landsat.
Okay.
Because one point was to provide indicators. Indicators needs trends. This also was
Right.
the speech of Tim before me. So you cannot have a trend if you have one point in time. So sorry, it's too little. If you have four, maybe it's still little, but you can start to have some trend analysis. So so it's not only by chance. Then, yes, I agree. The system as it was built, and it's also the difference between the GHSL system and other systems, was built already at the beginning as, let's say, independent from any source of satellite data. So basically, we can input anything and get out the gold. So it's independent. We don't put a PhD student to work 6 months in tuning the algorithm to get out the results. This is not our approach. And I think this was a good design because actually we demonstrated the system is resilient against large change. I mean, if you input radar data, optical data, different sensor, different resolution, and different technical characteristics, we demonstrate that you get always very consistent output. It's a good sign.
Yeah, one quick question, Tom.
Tom, Fitzroy, U.S. Census Bureau. I was just wondering if there have been any attempts to validate the accuracy of the global human settlement layer in different parts of the world and different land covers and whatnot? Thank you.
Yeah, of course, we did the quality control, and this is, so if you go in the document, you will find the reports about that, and then of course we are not handling a big budget, a big project, so we are not able to deploy hundreds of visual interpreters double checking. This was so basically we were checking against available cartography. That was the approach we took. I mean, if we talk about the buildings, then the idea was to collect the buildings from digital cartography, and then we have a protocol to assess this. The problem is that you can assess this only against data-rich countries that provide digital cartography. So actually, we were biased by the fact that we estimate a given accuracy, but then the given accuracy is tested only against rich countries. So we don't know against data-poor countries. So that was the main critical about the protocol we deployed for validation. There is a good news. The good news is that thanks to this international partnership, we were able to aggregate efforts, and a new campaign on global built-up areas will be assessed using crowdsources. Will start October, November, so we are defining the latest technical specs on that together with the EASA and DLR. So basically, the two producers of built-up area information together with the EASA that has already experienced in other campaigns, like campaign for agricultural areas and sides of the fields. It's based on crowdsources. And let's see how it's going. But we all hope that this is a good experiment. Let's see.
Great. Well, we need to move on. But I will say, come on up, Alan. I will say one thing that, of course, part of the purpose of Human Planet Initiative and some of the projects is to promote more intercomparison and validation efforts. So, that's one of the reasons we're here and trying to share not just the data, but the methods and the tools and the reference data sets and so forth. So our next speaker, Alan Belward, another European Commission JRC person.
Yeah, this is the JRC session, apparently. So both of us work behind those hills in the background. That's where the JRC is. That's where we're both from. So I'm going to talk about global dynamics of surface water. And the first challenge is that there isn't much of it. When you're looking at surface water, water sitting on the land surface, it's less than 1 in 1,000 litres of the water that we have in the world. So you've got to look hard to find it, not a lot to look for. It's worth looking for, though, because it's so massively important to everything. It's important for climate, for consumption, for energy, for pollution, for health, for biodiversity, for transport, all sorts of different things. Second challenge, water moves. We know water flows, but over time, surface water changes quite dramatically. Lakes shrink with climate and with use, but they also grow. We build a dam across a river, and suddenly it ain't a river anymore, it's a lake. And that lake will increase and decrease with time as well. So first challenge, not very much of it. Second challenge, it can be anywhere at any time. And that can be time over year to year, because the dam is built, the dam is taken away, the lake dries up, the river meanders, the river moves, the coastline moves. So all of that happens. Second thing is even within a year. Wet season, wetlands. Dry season, gone. Growing season, rice paddies flooded. Growing season over, dried out, harvested. Summer season, melt ponds. So it's a very, very dynamic process. So looking at that on the global scale, you've got to look everywhere, every day, if you're going to map surface water. So we used the entire Landsat archive, all 3 million Landsat scenes that were held in the L1T processed archive we used in this. So if you go back in time, this is how it works. This is 1984. It's a single scene. We operate at the pixel level, not the scene level. We take every pixel from every image. Even if it's 99.5% cloud covered, that still leaves a few pixels that aren't cloudy. So we take every single scene, every single pixel. These ones I just chose because they're cloud free. So the dam is built, the river is closed, lake forms. It's a man-made lake, human-made lake, and so it can contract. So over time, it moves in and out. So this is a very dynamic process that you've got to track. And your next challenge, if you like, on the global scale is that water doesn't come in one flavor. It really does depend on what's under it and what's in it color-wise. Everybody says it's the easiest thing to map. It is if you're doing one scene. But like Martino, if you're trying to do it globally everywhere in an automated fashion, then you've got to address that. You've also got to deal with the fact that there's an awful lot of stuff out there that isn't water, that looks like water, and you have to resolve that problem. So this is another computational challenge, and we do it, again, in a fully automated way. We have an expert system which operates in HSV space and basically assigns a probability to a pixel of being water or land, and that's it. So we take 3 million scenes, every single pixel, and decide, is it a valid observation? If it's a valid observation, is it land or is it water? And that's the end of the story. But we have to do it for 3 million scenes. We actually used more than 1,200 years of CPU time for every run that we did with that expert system. And luckily we did this with Earth Engine, people from Google Earth Engine, and they very kindly let us loose on all of their thousands of machines. So we ran it in their cloud. And we've produced these maps here, which include time, basically. So the intensity of the blue is determined by the amount of time a pixel has been underwater. If it's white, it's never been water once in 32 years of observation. If it's bright blue, every time we looked at it, it was water. And the other tones are depending on was water, now land, now water, was land, sometimes water, sometimes not. So you build that up. Validation. We put this one through a systematic, random, unaligned sample, basically, 40,000 control points to come up with an error of omission and an error of commission, which is valid over time. So that includes for the whole time dimension as well. That then allows us to put error bars on the data set and to assign a value to countries. So we can then break it down into which countries have lost water between 1984 when the time series begins, and which ones have gained water and which ones haven't changed. Globally speaking, what we've discovered is that there are about 90,000 square kilometers of lakes. They were there for 12 months of the year previously, and now they're gone. And that we can look at in detail. So we can take a country like Australia, we can look at the whole of Australia, and we look at the annual permanent surface water for that country over the 32 years, and you quite clearly see the impact of the Millennium Drought, when the surface water disappeared for a few years. Then we had the break in the drought, and it's returned to normal. You have the same situation actually in the western states. You can go down to different levels of aggregation. This is just a state level analysis that was done showing the 6 western states between 84 and 2015, and you have that steady decline like Lake Mead, which is the famous one. When you look at it globally, you see obviously the Aral Sea shines out like a beacon. That's gone. We can also map not only the change, but also how it's changed. So when we take this data set, it's not just about occurrence and occurrence change intensity, it's about transitions. Has it gone from permanent to seasonal, from seasonal to land to permanent, from permanent to land? And we're able to map those changes that we have. And we're able to look at the rate of loss for the Aral Sea. It's a quite staggering 1,200 square kilometers a year is the actual rate for that body of water. Then there's ones that people don't really think about, like the Hamoon wetlands. They've gone. And in fact, Afghanistan, Iran, and Iraq are all losing water at an incredible rate. Those 3 countries. In fact, 5 countries account for 70% of that 90,000 square kilometer loss. Lake Urmia is a famous one. Also, all the lakes around Baghdad. If you look at those in detail, you also see how fast the change is occurring. This is in 1985. This is in 2000, almost no change. That's 2015. In 15 years, it's gone. So it's quite impressive. Then we turn our attention to the gain. Who's gaining? Where's new water appearing around the world? You don't see that in quite the same concentrated way. There is no Aral Sea in terms of gain. There are 24 countries that have gained more than 1,000 square kilometers. We've got Brazil, we've got the US, we've got Africa, we've got Spain and well, Africa, Sudan, let's be honest. This is just one country there, that particular map. Turkey, India. There's many, many different countries that have increased. In total, we might have lost one Lake Superior, but we've gained 2. So we've gained 184,000 square kilometers of new lakes in the past 30 years. That's an awful lot of permanent. Well, it's permanent as long as the dams stay there. If the dam goes, then it's not permanent. But for now, there's 184,000 lakes that weren't there 30 years ago. One area is increasing without damming, and that's the Tibetan Plateau. And there, we see every single lake, almost without exception, increasing in size. And over the 32 years, we have a trend line like that. We've got an increase of 8,000 square kilometers of water on the Tibetan Plateau in 32 years. The only rational explanation we can come up with is snow melt and glacier melt. Nobody's building dams. It's nothing else. It's got to be climate related. So I've shown you 3 of the maps, but there are actually 6 maps that go into this data set. There's the transitions, there's the occurrence change, and there's the occurrence. There's also recurrence, which is that end one, which tells you how likely it is that water will be there when there's water. So it could be that you've only got water in the months of April, May, and June, because it's a seasonal wetland, but it's in April, May, and June every single year. There's a very, very high recurrence. And that becomes extremely important if you're looking at things like cattle movement and cattle management, grazing. You can break it down by single year, and within a year you can look at whether water is present for 12 months or only a few months. So you can break out seasonality as well. And then the third and final map is the maximum surface water. So we've taken every pixel where we've found water over 32 years and summed that up. So those are all there, so we're able to use it for all sorts of different modeling applications and the like. We are already using these data as one of the essential climate variables, where we've taken all of the permanent water that is completely unchanging. That's actually 87% of the lakes haven't changed one iota in 32 years. Every time you look, it's a lake, it's a lake, it's a lake, it's a lake, not moving. And that's important for the climate models, because it's a forcing factor. We've also provided UN Environment with the 193 countries' annual permanent surface water measurements as a test for 6.6.1, and then there's other things that we're working on in the future. So the conclusions: petabyte scale processing is achievable, you can do it, but it's not trivial. As I said, it was 1,200 years of CPU for one run, and I won't tell you how many runs we had, but Google did joke that we dimmed the lights in Mountain View every time we were working, which was that was what they said. As we've just heard with Martino's talk, fusing data is the way forward. This is entirely Landsat based, but we're already working on mixing in Sentinel II and Sentinel I into the equation as well. That will take us down to 20 meter, probably in the first instant, horizontal. We'd like to aim for weekly as a time step. We should be going for better than that as a community. And one of the things that we found, like now with UN Environment, it's very important to engage the users very early on, and preferably even before you start the analysis, and that's part of the learning exercise. And then dissemination should be a two-way process, and it isn't at the moment. Everything that I've shown you is available, including the raw data, including the time series down at pixel level. If you go to that website, you can actually access all of the data. You can access the whole history. You click on the map anywhere, and you can go into full 30-meter resolution anywhere on the globe, covering the 32 years. Full, free, and open. Thank you.
Wow, and I didn't even have to give you a 2-minute warning.
Oh, okay.
That's great. So we have lots of time for questions. I imagine there are going to be some, so. Please,
Water, it's good to drink.
Thank you.
My name is Lars Heijn. I'm from Wageningen University in the Netherlands. I had a very short question, really interesting presentation. Are you able to map flooding under forests, and are you planning to do that in the future with the Sentinel I images?
I should have specified that. This is open water. We only map open water, so it's open to the sky. So even rivers, you will find in there that some of the very narrow rivers, when you're getting down to the 30-meter limit, will be broken where there's overhanging vegetation. It all comes down to the expert system, and it's that differentiating between land and water. And so at the moment, we don't map vegetated water, no.
All right, thank you.
there's a question behind. Yes.
Cristian Fluerauter, Signal Romania. Did you encounter any co-registration problems, especially with the older Landsat images? And if so, how did you deal with them?
There were registration problems, and they ended up being junked as part of the non-valid observations. We would run the time series backwards and forwards as part of the cloud detection system as well. That you look at the time pattern. Clouds move and the shadows move, and the water bodies don't move that much. So that was part of the sequence. So we would detect those in the processing chain and then exclude them from the data set. There were surprisingly few, though. The L1T.
My next question, actually, about the percentage.
I can't remember the number off the top of my head. It's in the paper, the data that we chucked out, but it's surprisingly good. The L1T was pretty damn good, actually. Yeah.
So I'm Ryan Engstrom from George Washington University. I'm curious about your validation and how much effort did you guys put into it, and how long did it take? And because that seems to be where we need to go with some of the human products, and so it's really interesting that you guys have done it. How do you feel about it? Limitations, problems, etc.
It was a nightmare. It was. We don't have an army of people. There were 4 of us worked on this, and it was just literally weekends of looking at. You'd lose the will to live sometimes. I mean, you're looking at. I mean, one guy. It was Jean-François Pekel, the lead on this, that did the lion's share of that. He trained us up in a couple of end validation quality checks where we go in and go, God, no, that's a shadow. It's not. It's in the mountains. It's not. But this was done on the basis of a systematic grid. 1 degree grid, and then a point randomly selected in that. We used the SRTM as surface water as a guide to high probability of water, and then Jean-François would actually check in the data set, because you randomly select over time then, the image. How long did it take? 3 years.
Okay, and then, just out of curiosity, did the whole pixel have to be water? Like all 30 meters, or like, how do you make a decision there?
Well, there is a certain amount of expert interpretation. If it's 3/4 of the way across a river, you would say there's a very, very high likelihood that that is a water pixel. But it is at the pixel level. I mean, most of them it's okay. I mean, when you're working right at the limits, which this is, then you can run into some problems. But Jean-François did an unbelievable job on it. And we have a database, actually, which we are beginning to make available to people of the validation data set. So there's an Excel chart which has got the scene identifier, whether it's the lat long of the pixel, and whether it was water at that time. Because that's the critical thing. That's why it's so damn difficult to validate water. Because, you know, take the Carque River, you know, in 19 there, even between August 2002 and August 2015, look how much the lake shrunk. You know, that's after it had formed. You know, back then it's a river, then it's a lake, then it's a big lake, then they realize there's too much water in it, so you let a load out. Yeah, it's tricky.
I'll ask a question on the way back. So I would think, though, the cloudiness problem could be correlated with some of the water things. So how did you kind of normalize or correct that?
The cloud is a big problem. It's cloud shadow, but it's movement. It's looking at it time-wise. So you take the probability. Most pixels are either unequivocally water or unequivocally land. Then you get the cloudy shadows that could be water, could be land, and then you look at it over time and you see, did that location move to an unequivocal land pixel 6 days later or the next observation? If it did, there's a pretty high probability it was shadow and not water. So we keep looping around in time within the time series to check on that. That's the big thing.
Okay, so Tarek Habib from CLS France. You've highlighted several times that the processing power required to do this is massive. 2 questions. How much are you bound to the Google Earth Engine platform? Is the code easily transferable to another platform? Second question is, are you considering or do you have in visibility the data and information access services that are being the DS platforms that are currently being developed by the European Commission as well?
Yeah, no, the long-term view is we move out of a research environment. This has been done in a research environment with a research collaboration with Google. It still is a prototype. It only goes up to October 2015. Google are kindly still working with us to bring it up to date to 2017. But that's just on a research basis. The intention is to go operational at some stage. It says internal European cooking, but this will require approval from the European member states to do it, because we'll then be using public money to operationalize it. Right now, the methodology is transferable, but that actual expert system operates in Earth Engine. But the science behind it is transferable. The methodology, which is described in the paper, you can access the paper as well on the website, tells you every decision that was made and the rationale behind it. There's a very long methods section in the paper that goes into all that detail.
Okay, last one.
Thanks, Eli Moore, USDA. The loss of water in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Iran, was that due to damming in their own in those countries, or damming due to in other countries, or is that still being worked out?
I'll say, go to the website, right? Look at the lakes around Fallujah and Baghdad, and then put on the global surface water occurrence change. So that's gain and increase and decrease. All the lakes around Baghdad decreasing. Follow the river up. You get into Syria, and suddenly there's a load of increases. Then you get over the border into Turkey, and there's another load of increases. I'm not going to draw the link between one and the other, but the patterns, there are patterns in there which we've not analyzed. So I couldn't say what the cause is, and there is internal damming as well. But you can follow any river, and you can do the same. If you go to the European Commission booth, the Eurogeos stand, there's one big poster of the Paraná River, and you see all the transitions in the lower reaches of the Paraná as it's drying out. And you see hundreds of new dams that have formed all around it. So, but go to the website.
But you don't have enough topography in there to estimate the volume changes, right? It's only the surface area.
No, that's another thing we're working on.
Okay.
It is just surface area at the moment.
At the moment.
Yeah, but there's 2 things. One is that we're already drawing up correlations with other people that are using altimeters to look at lake level rise,
right,
so that you can start to make a volumetric, a correlation between area and volume. And then there is also the possibility to model using a digital elevation model, although they're not that good.
Yeah. Wow. Anyway, thanks again, and we'll move on to Christoph Albrecht.
Thanks. Gonna be tricky to follow up on this one. So yeah, thanks for having me on this in this session. So my presentation will focus less on one particular product, but it's going to be a little bit more broad in addressing the general agenda on sustainable urban development and how we at ESA actually see that. Obviously, I'm just, the one now talking, but this draws upon work of a lot of colleagues, including Mark and others. So just before the lunch break, I was at the Blue Planet session, and I actually started with this slide. So this is one perspective. So in the urban context, probably we are rather moving towards something like that. The truth is, of course, that it's somewhere in between, right? And the best way to predict the future is to create it. So we should actually take an active role in changing this to something like this, where the urban and the rural areas are working together in a balanced and harmonized way, and we are far away from this. So I always try to see it in a more holistic perspective and not just focus on urban, on built up, even though I've been doing a lot of this. So before taking on the ESA role, I was actually leading a team at the World Bank using a lot of these data sets, and so I was actually involved in this human planet thing since, well, before it existed. So now bringing in a different flavor. A lot has been said about the Sentinel data. Obviously, Sentinel I, Sentinel II, most important ones for urban. Sentinel II as a follow-up to the Landsat archive, and Sentinel I, providing a even more fine-scale understanding of built-up patterns due to its the radar signal. All of this open and free. I'm not going to go into this. This is important, and this hasn't been actually shown so far. At least I haven't seen it today. In the context of the SDGs, right? So it's called 2030 Agenda. So the Copernicus system really ensures the continuity of the data and a consistent access to the data in an open and free manner. So this is important to understand. With all the fancy commercial capabilities that are popping up, I would see them as a complementary asset for a lot of questions you might have. You will not be able to address these questions with the free and open data, but actually, and we've seen this in our experience working with the development banks, for most of the questions in the sustainable development domain, you can answer most of its aspects using open data. And obviously now open data, Copernicus is probably the main thing to go. So ESA has in addition to just making the data available, we have this concept of the thematic exploitation platforms, where we are trying to bring the people to the data as opposed to bring the data to the people. So the amount of data is simply too big, and I guess with the previous talks I don't need to go into details on this. So we need to move things to the cloud. And what makes the thematic exploitation platforms different to, let's say, Google Earth Engine or others, is that we see this as an enabling mechanism and as a collaborative platform. So it's not only the processing environment, but it's actually a community platform. It brings communities of a certain topic together. They develop tools very specialized for a certain topic. We address different stakeholders with that. Let's say in the geohazards tab, we work with civil protection agencies that may not necessarily be experts in spatial data handling, but they can still use those tools available and work with the community to maybe create different tools that then can address their needs. As one specific example in this particular context, the urban thematic exploitation platform, and we have Mark here in case anybody has more specific questions, but the focus is really on the thematic applications. So it's not just the processing environment. And it focuses on global products, it focuses on on-demand, regional and local hotspot observations. Monitoring is a big part, and especially integrative and comparative studies. And, well, obviously it has a set of key technical functionalities, and I will not just read these now, but as I said, the main thing that makes the TAP concept different is really the collaborative understanding, the networking and these kind of things, in addition to the computing infrastructure, the access, the data management, and all these kind of things. So ESA's approach to sustainable development and implementing that is multifold, obviously. So we support the production of global data sets. We try to work with the custodian agencies. We try to provide country support, especially in our engagement with the development banks and the IFIs. And in addition to these, obviously the software development, toolboxes, platform development, and so on is a major part. So moving towards the more urban context of the human planet crowd. So there's this SDG indicators metadata repository provided by UN Stats, and I just take these few indicators out of SDG 11. So slums, informal settlements, access to public transport, sustainable urbanization, urban air pollution, urban green public areas. So how can we use remote sensing or Earth observation data to address these? And you see that the tier is at the very right. So tier 1 means we have actually an established methodology and a lot of data available. And you also may notice that there is no tier 3. So I'm trying to show some where we can use Earth observation in a good way at the moment. So this is 11.1.1, so urban population living in slums. So we can obviously use Earth observation data nicely to first identify and characterize informal settlements. And this is a big need in the development community, so in the World Bank especially, but also Asian Development Bank. There's an increasing focus on this, and we're trying to support them on that. This is another example for population that has convenient access to something. So basically what you do is you can create buffers and measure distance to certain items of interest and disaggregate population there. This was a support to Asian Development Bank. No need to follow up on GHSL, I assume. Maybe to just provide a broader picture. Obviously there are other built-up data sets out there. And one that we have been extensively supporting is the global urban footprint. And there are a few novel developments in that regard developed under the SAR for Urban project that ESA funded. There are a lot of groups working on these issues. This is another thing, integrating Landsat, Sentinel I. And there is obviously methodology under development integrating Sentinel I and Sentinel II. Different methodology, and actually, especially under the human planet guidance, there was a couple of comparative studies that looked into how GHSL differs to GUF, but I believe it was with the previous version of GUF, not with the GUF Plus. Anyway, so the community is really, it's on the community now to do this validation, because obviously all the groups say, well, my data is the best, right? So that's something that's coming up all the time, and I'm not looking at you. Community it's up to the community to decide that and to really do substantial validation. So that's what in the World Bank also, the World Bank as a user is very much behind that. Indicator 11.6.2, air pollution, and now with the recent launch of Sentinel 5P, we'll have another data source for that. And this one is green public areas and extent. So how does this all actually fit into the broader context of the sustainable development community? So ESA has a program we call Earth Observation for Sustainable Development, which kind of summarizes our engagement with the international development community, specifically with the international financial institutions. We've been doing this since almost a decade now. A lot of pilot studies, demonstration studies that illustrated the use of Earth observation, satellite technology, and geospatial analytics. And at some point then we came to the decision that, well, it has been demonstrated, the value is proven, we need to scale this up. And so that's what we are doing right now. We identified a set of thematic priority areas. And when I say we, it's not that ESA identified that, but it's in an iteration with our development partners, with the development banks. And now we operate along these 10 thematic lines in a strategic sense. It means we We support the development banks, and we work with them to identify priorities, what needs to be tackled next, and try to basically really in the long run transfer Earth observation and mainstream it into operational working processes of the banks. It's a process, but we are making steps. This is the current portfolio we have under the 3 active thematic clusters, which are urban development. So that is one, water resources management, and the third one is agriculture and rural development. And we are currently evaluating the proposals we got for the next 4 clusters we open, and we will open them in hopefully December. We'll then have a 3-year time window where we can engage with the banks on 4 further topics, and these are climate resilience, disaster risk reduction, fragile and conflict states, and marine and coastal environment. Few takeaway points. So obviously we've seen that in all the talks, Earth observation has a high potential to deliver key environmental information that can inform the urban SDGs, but obviously many other SDGs as well. And this is key, support the planning, implementation, monitoring, and assessment of urban development projects. So it can really help in the entire project cycle. We're also investigating now how to help them use, them means the development banks, help them use Earth observation data for targeting investments. So at the very first stage of projects. Implementation, monitoring is still clear, and then also impact evaluation, assessment of how your investments, how your decisions actually, what was the impact of these decisions. I will not repeat the urban SDGs. Value of global urban extent data is crucial. Also in a combination with other data sets, obviously. So these, most of the previous talks referred to integration of different sensors, but obviously we need to integrate with a lot of other things to come up with consistent measures. And while these all provide input, consistent input, and that is a very big point of remote sensing data, consistent input to multi-scale development projects. The World Bank Group, for example, has been using the GOF and also GHSL for a while, and there's quite an excitement about that. But the uptake really depends also on further awareness raising, capacity building, because they are not. So the World Bank has 16,000 people for them, and I assume 15,500 are economists. So it's sometimes. Sorry, Alan. So anyway, so now that you are here, maybe I should say that the bank has a community of practice on geospatially interested people, and that reach is roughly 400 to 500. So my 15,500 was probably not so bad, I guess. In any case, it shows you that there's a lot of awareness raising, capacity building needed, and we are trying to support the banks on that. And yeah, considering the vast amount of data, obviously we need collaborative platforms. We need to work with Google, we need to work with Amazon and Microsoft, and we hopefully can have our own system at some point independent of the commercial giants. And at the moment, things like UrbanTap and the general thematic exploitation platform concept is probably crucial in addressing these needs. Thanks.
Great, thanks, and thanks for keeping very good time. Stay up here. You got to answer questions. Questions?
I have a question, Bob.
Oh, go ahead.
I have a general question about lane cover. And the question is as follows. Let's say the lane cover concept was introduced in the 70s as by Anderson and company as a set of mutually exclusive class, so thematically exclusive. So if you are one class, you are not another class. This was the basic concept. Now we have seen that if you want to solve global, let's say, dynamic problem at the decametric scale, both ourselves and Alan, we were going for, let's say, systematic. So we simplified the task. So instead to have a multiple class, mutually exclusive, we target one abstraction, and we do that systematically over time with different sensors, etc. So we can call that mono obsessive land cover. I don't know what we can call that. But the point is that I have the feeling that this is not the original idea of land cover. So the question is, if you feel the same, if you feel this is the next direction, the next trend is to have a monothematic cover that they not necessarily mutually disagree, because one pixel could be built and water. Of course, hopefully we say not, but actually we're not enforcing that. There is no global, apart that we talk together and we say let's try to avoid, but there is no enforcing agency that says, look, if the pixel was classified by GHSL as built up, let's avoid to classify as water and etc. But in principle, those products, they don't enforce a mutual exclusivity of the thematic information. So you might have the same sample with different classes. Okay, so the question is, do you see this is a trend, or is just by chance that we were taking this path, and then probably we will converge again happily in the next years with the decametric resolution, classical land cover, dynamical?
I mean, I guess there are several answers to that. I think that at the moment it looks like people really focus on individual classes more than the general thing, with an exception probably being the CCI land cover of ESA. But I would even take this a step further, right? So I'm actually glad you are always talking about built up. In the development context, this is often misunderstood as urban, right? So land cover and land use is traditionally, a very strong field in remote sensing, but the development community doesn't get that, right? So they say, okay, we have a built-up data set, so this is all urban. Well, it's not, right? So a village in a rural area is still built up, but is not urban. And to the next step then, at the same time, even not everything that is urban and rural and built up might necessarily be exclusively urban or rural, but there's this continuum between urban and rural, which almost nobody in the remote sensing community really addresses. I mean, we have these attempts also by Louis and so with trying to have the core centers and the belt around it and so on, but it's still not a continuum. It's just adding more classes, to be honest, right? So how can we address this? I don't know, but I think that is crucial, because especially how the banks also disperse their projects, and so and not only the banks, but the governments, they often actually rely on these indicators. Okay, is it urban or rural or not? And this is a statistic sometimes. So we probably need to move towards a more integrated view of these dynamic, what is what, and not necessarily this is one class or the other. But how to do that, I don't know. I don't know.
That's I think an important issue that a couple of our groups are trying to address.
So I think adding to that, one of the challenges that I see is that the classical approach towards land cover, which Martino's talking about, is either led by techniques learned in forestry-based techniques that were applied to urbanization and remote sensing, or just because we're trying to meet the expectation of a specific community like climate modelers. If you go to GCOS right now, there's only one essential climate variable that's associated to our community, that's land cover. That's the ECV. That's tied to the WMO requirement. It's not land use. And if you go to the Topsy panel and ask for it to be an ECV, they say, where's the requirement coming from? So I think it's given that this is the GEO meeting at the international level, we need to see how the requirements that are being taken from Human Planet then scale into all these other international organizations, because otherwise it's just going to be a 2 degree by 2 degree GCM, and that's what's being used. And so, yeah, I know now we're finally starting to get at the Topsy level and really trying to hack into what's really just being climate-driven requirements beyond, prior to COP21. And, anyways, I'll just leave that there, because I fought for the ECV denomination through many different avenues.
Did you have a comment, reply? Or?
Oh, okay. No,
I was just thinking, you know, just like we did with the water, you could do exactly the same thing with always vegetated, always sometimes vegetated, sometimes vegetated, never vegetated, and you could map the cover like that. Yeah, concrete would be another one. So you could actually finally get up to Martino's version of it, where we just do it one class at a time. I mean, in a way, that's what's happening anyway. Let's think of Matt Hansen's forests. That's kind of the way that we're going.
Mark?
Yeah, no,
I wanted also to comment a bit on the land cover. I mean, what was not existing in the past is actually the time series that we have now, both with Sentinel I and Sentinel II, and I should add Landsat. So we have the temporal dimension that allows on one way to be more precise in what we map. So you're more precise on the urban, because you know urban is very stable in time. So by using the time series, if you see that it's stable, the chance that it's urban is higher with respect to the other type of land cover for which you have you might have a confusion. But it gives also the temporal dimensions that we need to put into the land cover. So there's lots of efforts, let's say. In Europe, we have the Eagle. I don't know if you're aware. There's the Eagle standardizations, where they put the time as one important component of the land cover. So that's something that is happening, and it will happen more and more in the future. Another thing I want to say is that your data has an amazing value as training data sets. We all do machine learning now. So what I mean is the classification is not anymore the issue. The issue is actually the training data set you use for your classifications. So if you look at the last, we issued the land cover of Africa as a first, not validated, by the way, we still have to validate it, but if you look at urban, it's very good. But one of the reasons why it's very good.
Can I add one comment?
Sure, comment.
Just following up on what you said on the dynamics that you use for certain that you need for certain land cover classifications. So actually, we spend a lot of effort also on classifying agricultural area, right? And here the dynamics and the seasonalities and so are crucial, right? So you can't handle them the same way like an urban area, because you even need the temporal signatures to even identify what kind of crop that it is, or if it's a two crop, if it's an area that uses 2 crops per year or 3 crops or whatever, so you need the seasonality for that as well. So and we actually spend a lot of effort on that now, given that we have those access to Sentinel data.
Okay, we are running really low, so maybe two last quick questions.
Hi, Christoph. This is Anne-Marie Schneider from University of Wisconsin. So having tackled urban areas and urban remote sensing for about 15 years, we've constantly been battling this issue of back to this continuum, how do we define cities? And I think we're poised right at this spot right now that we have all these data, we have all these platforms now coming online. My question for you guys is, which communities do we really turn to start defining what we want urban to be? Because this is something that I've grappled with. You have the transportation folks, you have the disaster management people. Everyone is wanting different things out of an urban remote sensing map. And so I'm just wondering if we can start to narrow the players in this field, or do we include them all? And who would that be?
There is somebody here.
That's a very, very broad question. I mean, I guess Luis can follow up on it, but let me add one sentence first, not from the ESA, but from the World Bank perspective. So actually, Alan was the one driving a lot of the definitions of how urban could be understood within the World Bank, but that was done from a globally consistent perspective, right? And trying to see if we can use these global definitions to actually maybe even convince some of the clients, means countries, to change their urban definitions, which is a challenge, right? But at the same time, we are still struggling with these projects at the country level, where you need to integrate your remote sensing-based derivative data with statistical information that is based on very clear classes, right? So I was leading a project in Central America where we had to come up with country disaster risk profiles and linking inventory regions that were clearly defined urban-rural. So we had to come up not with a global approach to urban-rural, but with one that actually matches the local definitions, because otherwise you cannot link the two data sets. So it's very tricky to see who is the actual audience or who drives those decisions, because both are relevant.
And just to add, since we are dealing with a community that's interested in this interface between national statistics and other kinds of measures, talking to the statistical offices about their definitions of urban, talking to the demographic community about their definitions, and trying to get that reconciled is just been a long, slow process, and I think it's going to take a lot of work to resolve that, and maybe Louis has a comment.
Yeah, I love your question, Amy. I think if you look out there, there are different kind of groups and people out there. I think there's some people out there who dislike aggregating data. So they really think anything that aggregates data is wrong. You just want to use the raw data at its highest spatial resolution, one group. Then you have another group who loves urban definitions and likes to talk about it. It's a small group. I am a member of that group. And some of them think of urban definitions as like endangered species. Like, hey, look, I found another one and another one. Let's keep them all alive. This is a narrow group. And then you have a massive group out there who can't use the raw data, who don't want more than one definition, and just want to be given one answer when they say, where does my city stop? And so what we're trying to do with the OECD, with the World Bank, with the JRC, is to try and provide that one answer if people only want one answer. If you want a comparable definition, this is what you can use, this is how you apply it, this is how you update it. Whether we will persuade everybody in this room, outside the room, I doubt it, but we can maybe persuade enough people that if they want a simple answer, this is one of the better options out there.
Thank you. So we are up on our break, but I just want to make one comment, because in 15 minutes we'll start the second panel, and it's really this transition from kind of the supply side to how do you get this great supply, this great data, and all these tools actually used, and how do you get the 500 people in the World Bank who are spatially aware to actually convince the what was it, 15,000 economists that what you're doing, and I have my own story which I won't give to you, but generally you have to translate what you think into the terms and units of analysis that your audience wants, and maybe you'll hear that after the break. I'm the first speaker, so I have a vested interest in getting you to come back, but that's what we're going to start talking about. And then Martino can crack the whip on me and the others.
I just want to defend those 15,000 economists. So there are a lot of very smart people around there who understand some of it, right? They're just not necessarily geospatial experts. That's what I want.
No, but okay, I will tell my story because you sort of know it. We did a study over 10 years ago, which was lots of great maps about hazards. But at the very end, there was an appendix, which was the summary of the results by country in dollar terms. That table was picked up out of our report, put in another independent expert, the IEG report, and they actually gave the team, Uwe Deichmann and others, whom you may know, and myself, a IEG award for best practice, whatever. But the point was, they took sort of the weakest part of the report, but it was in dollar terms, and that's what they used and moved on with, because it was meaningful to an economist. Dollars and countries are great for development banks, right?
But Uwe is a really bad example for that, right? Because Uwe is probably the person who integrates geospatial and economy in the bank. Unfortunately, he left the bank.
Yeah.
But, so yeah, anyway.
Anyway, please come back about 3:30. Anyway, thanks. And as I said before the break, I think there'll be several talks that kind of make this transition of how do we do a better job of getting data to actually be used and be useful and have an impact. And, we have plenty of great imagery and people ooh and ah, but does it change behavior? Does it change policy? And we have things that we do. So Miguel's here. Borrowed these from the NASA Earth Observatory. And, you know, in Puerto Rico, you can start to see before and after based on things like nighttime lights. So that's a little bit of an impact, but still just a visual image. How do you quantify that and make that actionable information that somebody's going to use in bringing the electricity network back or in guiding aid and so forth? So there's still this gap between, okay, now, you know, we had a picture of a hurricane, now we have a before and after, but what do we do with it? So that's sort of what I want to get at. And what I want to get at is not so much the technical issues about doing it, but how do we get people to trust what we do? And trust isn't just, gee, did the paper was described in a peer-reviewed scientific paper and got published, right? So how do we you know, do a good job of thinking about what makes data trustworthy enough to have people make decisions and take actions based on it. So there's a group that we're involved in with the ESIP Federation, which is a GEO participating organization. Within that has been talking about this trust issue, and I'll give you a little more of the specific context. But here's some of the questions we were talking about this summer at the ESIP Federation summer meeting. So, you know, you have to make sure the data is appropriate. You know, we do have, as scientists have a tendency to say our data must be good for everything that we run across, and we're always trying to sell it. So, you know, we really have to be honest. Is this really appropriate data that's got a chance of being relevant to the actual decision? Is it, you know, reasonably accurate and complete? Are there gaps? Are there uncertainties? Yeah, scientists do like to talk about the uncertainties, and that actually can be a problem. But we'd still need an assessment of this if people are going to make decisions about it. And is the source itself trustworthy? I mean, you can have the issue of the data seems, you know, high quality and good, but people do rely on Bloomberg as a source of financial data because it's more trustworthy than other services. They're in the real world, the source and its track record and its trustworthiness and independence and so forth is valued, and we have to think about that. I love this cartoon. If you can't read it in the back, it says, a Category 4 hurricane is on track to make landfall by morning, and residents are advised to evacuate. Those who do not trust the media, of course, can just stay put. So, more questions. Is the data really accessible and usable by the users, the stakeholders? Is it available when it's needed, you know, 24/7 by 365? And is it going to be there? So a lot of questions that we get from users in the private sector is, if I spend money planning to use data, I want to make that investment last for a few years. I don't want the data source to go away because it's a NASA research instrument that could die tomorrow, and there's no operational commitment to it. So those, you know, that's the persistence question. And one of the biggest things, is there somebody I can call about the data when it's down or have a question? Is there user support? So these are some of the dimensions of trust that we've been thinking about. And so when I think back at what Geo's been doing, I've been involved for a long time in it, think about these 6 characteristics. And, you know, Geo does work on making sure the data is appropriate through all the different societal benefit areas and initiatives. It does work on accuracy and completeness. You know, we have data quality tasks, data management tasks. Trustworthy of source, it's really, Geo depends on all the members being trustworthy sort of on their own, and hasn't, I don't think, really addressed that issue particularly beyond the fact that people join and come from countries. Accessibility and usability, certainly Geo and GEOS has spent a lot of time, I'll talk about that in a bit. Timeliness and persistence, that's also very dependent because GEO's a voluntary intergovernmental organization. People bring what they have. If they stop having it, there's no penalty or anything, right? And the support is very scattered because it's really devolves back to the providers. So I've highlighted those where, I think, and I could be wrong because I don't know everything that goes on in Geo, but these are ones where Geo really hasn't had a lot of effort or to work on these particular characteristics of trust. So just run through what sort of my sense is of some of the opportunities and challenges. As we've heard already, we are trying to make the data more appropriate, decreasing the scale, improving the different methods and using multiple properties that can be viewed using different kinds of sensors to look at the same thing and get a better sense of what the actual phenomenon or dynamics are. We certainly, as you've heard in the Human Planet, are trying to get at the issue of intercomparison. We talked about validation. These are all things that are at least on the agenda and people are thinking about. I think trustworthiness comes partly from best practices. Yesterday I helped run the data sharing, data management principles working group side event and uses and standards. These are part of Geo's agenda. As you know, the Hulk is often called the Incredible Hulk, but it's a great cartoon. If you can't see it, he said, "You wouldn't like me when I'm angry because I always back up my rage with facts and documented sources." So that's the Credible Hulk. And we work on increasing accessibility, certainly, and usability. But one of the big issues is to what extent are we working with stakeholder communities? So the GEOS portal helps with access. And we've started these initiatives to work with, for example, all the different major UN agreements, including the SDGs. It's been a focus of a lot of the discussion today, but also the Sunday Framework and the Habitat and the Framework Convention on Climate Change. So these are all policy communities that have needs, and I think there's been more interaction with the stakeholder communities. Are we getting data out in a timely manner? Well, we heard as a research product, we're perfectly happy to go to 2015 on the water data to make it operational and useful. How do we get it to near time and make it operational? So that's timeliness. And is it going to be there constantly so that people can actually, build decision processes, build businesses, whatever, to use that product for some period of time? That's a gap. And I put in a plug for the World Data System, which is the network of data centers I'm partly representing that tries to think about some of those longer-term stewardship issues. And then how do we interact with the users more directly to give them the kind of support they really want? That's also an area where I think the Global Partnership on Sustainable Development Data has been useful and is thinking about it. I assume you can see the road to success. On the road to success, there are no shortcuts. Unfortunately, I don't know the credit for that photo. But. So the specific case I want to mention is that we've been working with a group called the All Hazards Consortium and the ESIP Federation. The All Hazards Consortium is a industry group in the U.S. It's focused mainly on after a disaster like all the hurricanes we've had, how do the utilities help each other by moving trucks around the U.S.? And it's actually complicated because trucks have to go from one state to another. There are all these rules and regs about trucks moving, and you have to have emergency declarations. The trucks, when they get there, have crews that need to know not only is the road open, but where can they collect and organize themselves? Where can they stay overnight for weeks while they're helping fix utility, wires, and where can they get the utility poles to replace, which of course is a big problem in Puerto Rico because you can't just drive it there. These groups, the utilities, are actually very interested in these other kinds of sources of data. Yeah. And so what we've been trying to do is develop a system to kind of categorize the operational readiness, not just the technology readiness, but the operational readiness of different data sources, including things like, is there somebody to call, person available to contact, those kind of basic things. But this has come out of a direct interaction with a bunch of private sector and government people. And so there's a tool that you can see called Geocollaborate, the URL's down here, and it pulls in data from open sources, puts them together, allows people to share data. A recent addition is this little button on the bottom, which is a bunch of people, and you click on it, allows you to draw a polygon around any of these warning areas or things. That polygon is sent to the server at my center, where we just tell you how many people are in that polygon, estimated to be. So it's just it's an open system, lots of inputs. But how do you make something that the industry people will trust? Literally down to the people who are telling the trucks where to go and can they go and so forth. So I think Human Planet Initiative is in this business of saying there's a lot of data. We already heard there's an information deluge. How do we make sense of it and boil it down to things that are actually usable? And you already saw the goals. And within that is something I mentioned this morning when I talked about a very specific effort to pull both the public and private sector data on population distribution together and do work together. So, but part of the objective is how do you deliver things that are actually more usable by the policy community. So just to summarize, it's important in this process that the data are open by default, which is the new version of the Geo data sharing principles. It's important that we interact with these international frameworks and get the data in and understood by statisticians and government officials and within the kind of policy framework that is established by these international agreements. We have to think about the trust that we put not just in the data but in the sources, and we want to work directly with these kinds of operational users so that we really tick off all the boxes that they need. And of course, no matter what you do, you can lead a human to knowledge, but you can't make him or her think. So that may be beyond our ken, but we have to try.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Very good. We are a bit behind schedule, but I think we can allow one question now, and then if we have time at the end.
Okay.
Is that fine with you, Bob?
Sure. You crack the whip.
If you no? They're all shy. The horses.
Okay, well, we should move on.
Very good. So the next speaker is Paolo Veneri from OECD. He will speak about data definition and tools to support the policy analysis with an international perspective.
Last joke. Was there a political angle to that, or is that just me reading too much into it?
So good afternoon, everybody. So this is the perspective of a user of this all these definitions. So it was very interesting for me this morning to understand all these details of the data on Earth observation and geospatial. But very interesting. From my perspective, I will bring how in the OECD we use part of this information, of course, to talk about cities, and why we talk about cities, and in which way we talk about cities, what data we are looking at, what type of information first on understanding what a city is, and also how then what do we do once we have a definition of city. Okay, so 3 points I will cover. First of all, what is the EC OECD definition of cities? So what do we mean by city? Second, what data do we attach at the city? So what's the user? What do we do with these cities? We attach to each individual city some indicators that can be used by several types of actors. Several types of actors meaning researchers, academics, international institutions, but also citizens and non-expert users. So it's important that the information is accessible. And 3, I will give you some examples, some of the stories, some of the narratives that we build in some of our different reports that built on this idea of having a comparable definition of cities. So I start with the EC or OECD definition of cities. First of all, why do we need a common definition of cities? Well, there are mainly 2, I would say, reasons. One is that we want to be able to compare what a city is across very different places. Places that internally they conceptualize differently what is a city. They provide different boundaries. They sometimes use administrative definitions, sometimes not. So we want to be able just to provide a picture that is robust enough when we talk about cities. Even even to provide the simple information, for example, how many people live in cities on average in OECD countries, for example, or to what extent cities have increased their population over the years. Second point is for policy. So why do we need a definition of cities which is not the national one or which is not necessarily equal to the administrative one? Because when it comes to urban policy or policies that are important at the city level, think about transport, planning, and many other housing or many other policy domains, the scale of the policy is very important. So we want to construct our report, our analysis, by using a meaningful unit of analysis, not just a unit of analysis that is more or less correct, but a unit of analysis that makes sense for policy analysis, so that for policymakers is a useful tool. Then, what is the approach that we use? Some of you already know it, but I mean, basically, when we talk about cities, in this case, we talk about what we call functional urban areas. So high-density places with high population density, surrounded by a space which has a lower density, but which is very much interconnected in terms of economic meaning to this high-density place. So we don't look only at the morphology, but we look at the functional organization of this place. We look at people, basically, where people live and how people move during the day. This is the idea to conceptualize our concept of city. What is the method? Very briefly, I mean, so we take very high, let's say, high-density clusters of population using geospatial information, using the population grid, for example, the one produced by Martino and his colleagues. Then, once we have identified this course, we adapt these clusters to the closest administrative local boundaries, and then through this adjustment, we can link the surrounding local administrative units that are connected in terms of commuting flows. So we are looking at commuting flows, let's say economic relationship in terms of labor market, to look at a city which is a city from an economic point of view. Then we use a minimum threshold which is 50,000, like the high-density clusters. And we applied this definition to 30 OECD countries, so all the European countries that are part of the OECD, because it's a definition which is commonly used also by the European Commission. and to other non-European countries, US, Canada, Australia, Japan, Korea, etc., etc. So at the end, we obtain like 1,200 cities in total. For those that are the largest one, so above 500,000 people, we construct a database, so a set of indicators where we can really compare cities in terms of size, in terms of air quality, in terms of, if for the future, some sustainable development goals, for example, or other kind of variables and information that you can that I'll discuss later. So this is just a visual representation of the method that I described. So we look at the red places, the identity cluster, we adjust to the municipalities, and then we include the commuting zone, which is the gray area based on the commuting flows. This is just an example. At the end we arrive at the result, which draws the boundary of the city, which simple polygons, as you can say in this simple map. For this is the case of France, where we have 83 functional urban areas, or 83 cities. Let's call it city for simplicity. And we can assess, so with this method, what is the share of urban population, what is the largest city, which is the smallest one, and the characteristics. For example, you see that the darker part is the core, is the high density part, and the surrounding part is the lower density part, which is connected. For example, we could analyze in the last decade how the population changed in the core and in the commuting zone. For example, why? Because it's an interesting story per se. For example, policymaking could be interested in whether there is a suburbanization in place or not. So, for example, we observe here that for the OECD countries, most of them are experiencing a much higher increase of population in the, let's say, in the commuting zone, but it's not always the case. There are a bunch of countries where this doesn't happen, especially in Europe, where the core actually is is increasing more than the commuting zone. Then, as I said, for these cities, we have constructed a database that we are developing over the years, because this definition was created since 2012, so it has been a while that we are working with this. Now we have a set of indicators that you can download from our website. Indicators covering demographic, issues of urban form, issues of administrative fragmentation, how many municipalities, local government do we have inside a single economic unit, for example, but also variables like the household income that we estimated through administrative data or some environmental indicators. Again, how to use these indicators is important, and that the information is accessible to the public and not only to the specialists. And this is an example of the rather simple web tool that we constructed for this specific database, so for this set of cities. If you go to that website, measuringurban.org, then you can click on each of the OECD metropolitan areas, the 281 cities larger than 500,000 people. And you can explore and visualize and rank all the cities based on the indicator that you choose, that you pick up. So this means that everybody can do it, basically, not just the experts. I will also use it when I have to brief and to prepare speeches to my hierarchies, because it's very fast and very, very quickly you can get some key informations. Just to give you some example, now I'm in the third point, just some of the narratives that we built. We know, for example, using these cities in a rather comparable way, how much of the population is in these functional urban areas. So we know, for example, that these 281 metropolitan areas across these 30 countries concentrate 49% of the population on average and generate 57% of GDP and 51% account for 51% of the employment. We also were able to understand what happens to the neighboring regions, so the territories that are not in the cities. For example, some of our analysis demonstrated that the regions that are closer to the cities, that's also why it is important to understand what is urban, what is rural, because we had also other researchers, so this is now quite a stable result. We observed that when let's say less urban places like rural regions or what we call intermediate regions that are closer to cities are actually experiencing in the last decades, the last 15 years, let's say, higher economic performance in terms of GDP, but also in terms of population growth, etc. So we are able to assess this type of economic phenomena trends across OECD countries. A couple of years ago, for 5 countries, we were able to measure in the levels of productivity at the city level using labor force surveys. So basically we associate, even using surveys or using other sources of information, administrative data, if we have the localization, then we can allocate each respondent of any type of survey or census, whatever, to where it is located in which city. And for example, we were able to demonstrate, to identify this agglomeration effect, so the fact that people that work in cities are on average more productive, and this productivity advantage increases with the size of the city. But also, we look at the fragmentation in terms of local government. So we have this economic definition of cities, but we also know how many local governments there is in each of these kind of functional urban areas. And we also found that actually this level of productivity that I talked about just a moment ago is negatively associated with this level of fragmentation, to what extent the decision making inside the city is fragmented. Then I wouldn't be too boring in explaining, in showing you many of the narratives that we built, but this is just to show that we are able, last year we launched one of our reports where we were able to measure the household income levels for 18 countries, and for 11 countries we were able even to measure the inequality and let's say even the share of the poverty, let's say, within the city using administrative data, which is it's nice to have individual information at the city level. So you go to one of these countries, you can rank the cities on the basis of their Gini coefficients for household income or their average household income, and it can be quite useful for many reflections that you can do. This is, for example, depicts the disparities in terms of the Gini coefficients by city. You have the most unequal city and the least unequal cities by country. It's just an example of one of the narratives that you can build. Again, the levels of education, for example. We observe that on average in the countries that we cover, these cities, if you compare with the non-urban places or the rest of the country, have 10 percentage point more of the share of highly educated people, highly educated people in the working age. So 10% points on average of difference in these OECD countries. Or we did something like assessing the way to which, in the last decade, we observe an inclusive growth pattern, for example. What are the cities that have grown in terms of economic GDP or income, but at the same time have reduced inequality? So, we have, for example, we are able to say that one-fifth of the cities that we are talking about experience this type of inclusive growth, let's say. I think that is pretty much it. What was just to exemplify what we can do with this data. How do we mean by cities, and what are the data that we have? Thank you.
Thank you, Paolo. Do we have a question on the floor? Okay, ever maybe one question? No, there is one question there.
And it's not, Tim Trainer, it's not a question so much as just an observation. So, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Thank you. So, Tim Trainer, so what you call cities, in the U.S. we would call those urban areas. That's how we would define an urban area. It would be a core, and then things like economic dependence and commuting data and other kinds of factors that play into making that the, oh, that doesn't work.
Yeah.
Sorry. That would make that the urban area. So what you're calling the city, we would call the urban area. So in that example, we see a difference in definition.
Okay, so I have just another question for you, and then we go home. And the point is, the question is, what is the challenge you see on using Earth observation derived data if you use this kind of data in your models? Which are the most prominent challenges that you experienced on that?
Well, more than challenges, I see opportunities in the sense that having more and more reliable data like the built-up areas, like the population grid, allows not only to identify, to understand what is urban, what is rural. For example, in this case, I started with the definition of cities. In this phase, it was key, it was crucial having the population grid for the definition, but a large number, I think, of information that comes from Earth observations are then very useful. So I would see more as opportunities rather than challenges to compute and increase then the base of indicators, the number of indicators to compare cities across themselves and internationally. So I think the definition is one step, and enriching the database with more and more information based on Earth observation is definitely one big opportunity.
Okay.
Whether I answer.
Thank you. Okay, so if we don't have other questions, I would like to ask Tom Fitzwater and Kip Dash, or yes, they are both there, from the U.S. Census Bureau, on a speech about Earth observation data for estimating population distribution and improving census operations.
Slanted surface. So thank you very much. So I am Tom Fitzwater, and I'm joined by my colleague Kip Desh. We are geographers with the U.S. Census Bureau, and today we're going to discuss Earth observation data for estimating population distribution and improving census operations, so providing something of a national perspective from some of these more global examples. So Kip and I represent different areas of the Census Bureau. Kip is primarily working on preparations for our upcoming 2020 census, and I work primarily on international projects. However, we are constructing tools and methods for both our U.S. and international projects that benefit each other. We leverage our agency's strengths as one of the largest holders of geographic information in the U.S. government, also as a center for excellence in the production and understanding of human geography and population data, and as an organization that's continually innovating to conduct our U.S. censuses and surveys more efficiently and effectively. So a little bit of background about the U.S. Census itself, or the U.S. Census of Population and Housing, generally just referred to as the census. It is mandated in the U.S. Constitution, Article 1, Section 2, that every resident of the United States will be counted every 10 years. So we're one of the few federal agencies that can point directly to the Constitution for the country itself and say we have a mandate. The census is the basis for many governmental decisions. So it's used primarily for apportionment, which is the assignment of a number of representatives for each state to the lower house of the U.S. Congress, the House of Representatives. It's also used for electoral redistricting, which is the electoral maps that are used at the federal, state, and local level governments to determine the size and the shape of those particular districts. And it's also used for economic and infrastructure development, planning, and funding. Just saw an updated number that U.S. Census Bureau data, not the census specifically, although that certainly is a major component of it, but U.S. Census Bureau data in general is used to direct something like $675 billion in federal spending. That's just the federal government. It's not discussing states, local governments, or private sector investments. So a tremendous amount of money is invested in high-quality census data, and we are invested in a high-quality census as well. So the location of established and new housing structures is fundamental in the Census Bureau's planning and execution of each decennial census. So the ideal census counts everybody once, only once, in the right place and at the right time. So place being the key geographic component of the census operation itself. So we need to know where housing units are located so that we can visit those housing units or capture the information from those housing units. So I'm not going to read every number on this slide, but just to say the take-home message is that the U.S. is a large, complex country, also as a system with a federal form of government. A great deal of authorities evolved to the states and local governments, so it's a cooperative effort of tens of thousands of governments in the United States to make sure that we have a successful census. So in addition to our domestic projects or U.S. projects, we also conduct applied research and analysis of population characteristics of other countries, including international population estimates and projections, HIV/AIDS research tools, and research into global aging issues. And we have a variety of geospatial data products as well, including subnational population data efforts as shown in the upper right corner, and also gridded population data sets. It's been a recurring theme over this particular event shown in the lower right corner. I'll discuss those a little bit further. Not mentioned on this slide is our international assistance program, which is funded primarily by the U.S. Agency for International Development, in which we work with lower income or developing country national statistical offices in helping them implement their censuses and surveys. So now I'm going to turn it over to my colleague Kip, and he's going to discuss U.S. applications of Earth observation data. Okay.
Hello, I'm Kip Desch. I'm with the Geographic Research and Innovation staff at the Geography Division at Census. I'm relatively new at Census. I have a background in remote sensing, mostly environmental, a lot of Landsat work. I'm also kind of a rarity at Census. That's changing. The Census has been really good at geographic information system demographics for a long time, world leading points there. But imagery has been slow for them to come around to that. But now we are one of the largest users of high-resolution imagery in the federal government. And according to Digital Globe, we are the highest civilian user of their data. So why did this come about? A little background, more background. 2010, or before, ready for the 2010 census, we sent out 140,000 people to walk all the roads and identify the houses and add new ones where we missed them. Huge operation, really expensive, really hard. I think everyone realized, probably Tim, one of the more prominent ones, that can't happen again. So they started after several research papers, started a program where they're going to do a lot of this canvassing in-office canvassing. That involves about 140 instead of 140,000 operators sitting in front of a computer with background imagery, high-resolution imagery, and our database sitting on top of it, verifying locations of housing and new houses. Also, where there might be boundary problems here and there. Successful program. Took about a year to run, though. It's already done. And it was pretty obvious to me when I first came to Census that it's a good program, but a lot of the work that's been going on right there is work that could be done with remote sensing. They're pretty much just identifying change. We could do that. We already had the high-resolution data. We already had the vector profile. I went out and found bits and pieces of LiDAR data and started building a prototype. Pretty simple. We have imagery. That's 4-band imagery. I can get a vegetation index, get a built layer versus vegetation layer. I have LiDAR data, point data, telling me the elevation. A lot of those points are labeled as ground. I make a layer of ground, subtract that from the built layer. I got buildings. I can make little polygons around them, compare it to our databases, and find out per census block where we have miscounts, or and set that up to another editor to fix. While the in-address office canvassing the goal was to move about 70% of the work off the field into the office. My initial work on this is that we compare very favorably to the human. We could probably work another 70% to to the computer as opposed to the human. Big problems though, and why this probably won't be implemented. We have data from NAPE imagery done every 3 years. I need something as close to census as possible to know when changes are happening. LiDAR data, that happens like every 8 years. So it's a really good tool for fixing our existing database, and it could be good in the future. But quite honestly, there's also a lot of groups out there building footprints. We might be able to buy them. But this is where we're looking to go forward with this kind of work. So Tom and I, at this time, were working together, thinking, hey, how can this all work together? How can we do international and domestic collaborations? Oh, I forgot to say, we can also validate our roads. But we're thinking change detection. I have to find change detection here in the US, as close to census time as possible, so that we can say, these areas are changing, we need to send people there, not, and not miss anybody. Tom's international work, looking for where the urban footprints is. It's pretty much the same thing. I need high repeat, new data, and probably have to add a little bit of cloud computing in there. But it was also essential that the data was free. And thanks to our friends over in Europe, the ESA has made Sentinel II available. I've worked with a lot of Landsat data, and it's just fuzzy as all get out for urban stuff. My mapping's always, nice big open areas. It's really not appropriate for like the kind of urban change we're looking for. Sentinel, I can actually find a new building spot in a lot of suburban areas. And if I looking at that one, that will give me that change text, that trigger for, hey, we need to send a human out there. I just like also you can see that even right here, there's a new building. And so right now we're building the computer infrastructure to like handle this hunkin' big chunk of data, and also the methodology for getting it through as quickly as possible. And since we're building this hunkin', huge cloud computing, we're also going to look at maybe doing some pattern recognition where we tile the entire country, run whatever high-resolution data through there, and do some histogram matching. Those histograms are actually pretty consistent if you're looking for an urban street or just a lane there, and it works. But we have to get the big hunk of computer. And now back to Tom for international.
Thank you, Kip. You bring a lot of energy and enthusiasm from down in Suitland. So a variety of human settlement data sets and gridded population surfaces have been mentioned already today. These are in no particular order. There's no preference here. Demo-based, which is our product, just so happens to be at the top in this particular example. But there's increasing number of these particular data sets, increasing demand for this type of data. And so now we're getting to the point where we have to start figuring out what's going on. Just a little bit of background. I think some of the other presentations have already covered this pretty well, but just in case anybody's walked in, one input when we're trying to get to a gridded population surface is to find where either built-up areas are located or to develop some sort of surface in which we can say with a certain likelihood that this location is inhabited by humans. And those surfaces are constructed using a variety of input data sets, some of which are derived from Earth observation data, for instance, vegetation indices, soil indices, slope, elevation, land cover, and then also can be derived from human geography data products, so settlement points, or gazetteers being an example. And I quizzed an earlier presenter on validation, but if you would like to learn more about our particular validation methods, I'm not the best resource. I will direct you to this particular paper at the bottom of our slide, which is available on our website. I'll give you a URL at the end of the presentation. We also have one of the co-authors sitting in the room at present. I can direct you to him if necessary. And the other input, so if we get a probability layer or a built-up layer, then the other input, at least most of the other data sets and our workflow uses this as well, is official statistics. So census is the ideal data source since it's a complete count of the population. It's generally available at a very low level of geography. The problem is that it's not timely. Censuses take place the UN, I should say, recommends that censuses take place every 10 years. The US has had a census every 10 years since 1790, but if you're looking at, say, 2019 and the last census was in 2010, there's a pretty big gap in data there. So you can supplement it with official estimates. You can do your own estimates and projections. You can use other demographic or household surveys, but it's still, the census is unmatched when it comes to that granular level of detail because it's a 100% survey. There's no sampling error. And so the result is a disaggregation of the census data to the built-up or probability layer. This is a shot of demo-based Pakistan. We've constructed data products for 3 countries, Haiti, Pakistan, and Rwanda. Working on South Sudan right now, a very difficult and very different environment from the other 3 countries, a very rural, dispersed population, and also a population that has experienced a great deal of complex humanitarian emergencies over the past decade or so. But you can see the advantage of using sort of these gridded population data sets for particular applications. The example that's commonly given is a disaster response or response to complex humanitarian emergencies, where those sorts of events don't follow statistical or administrative geography. So if you need a population estimate for an area where an earthquake is struck or a hurricane's about to strike, then these sort of gridded data sets give you the ability to produce those custom zonal statistics and geographic estimates at any scale. So just a high-level overview of some of the projects we're looking at in the U.S. and internationally. Some of our next steps for the U.S. as Kip mentioned, we're looking at using Sentinel data as a change detection tool to better identify areas of change as close to the census data as possible, and also with the goal of improving operational efficiency and our data quality and to save money. We're exploring Sentinel-based human settlement prediction approaches for our demo-based program. As I mentioned, the next project is South Sudan. And from a technical perspective, we're prototyping a number of scalable image processing solutions using cloud-based, using open source or commercial software. So here's our email, contact information. You can also visit our website. The demo-based products, the gridded data sets are available, as well as a variety of the subnational data I showed earlier at census.gov/population/international. And the U.S. geography work is all housed at census.gov/geo. Thank you.
Very good. We have one question on the floor. You want the microphone?
As I work for the European Commission, I'm very happy to see that Sentinel data is being used here in the U.S. That's reassuring to me. On the other front, could you tell us a little bit about how demo-based works? I'm not familiar with the project, and I'm curious to see how you distribute population using in those projects.
Well, again, I'm not the best resource. I am looking at the person who helped devise the methodology, if you would like to.
So, want me to answer that for you? Yeah, I'll answer it for you.
So for demo-based, my name is Ryan Engstrom. I'm at George Washington University. I used to work as a consultant for this project and kind of develop the methodology. What we did originally was built-up area using Landsat, but we went after percent impervious using a CART methodology, regression trees. And then for Pakistan, we added a way to come up with a probability of people living there, because we knew not everybody's living in built-up areas. And so we said, okay, if we measure the built-up area, people are probably living close to built-up area. And then they're not living high elevations, not living on steep slopes. Looked at land cover and said, if the land cover is broken up, people are probably living there. If it's not, it's not. And then what we did, and what was kind of interesting in this project, is we had census data at a very high resolution for certain cities, and we used those to validate and develop models to do the population redistribution for about 60 cities. And so we had it at state level, had a city, use that for validation for our predictions. And what you see is we're pretty close when you're making this. And it was the first time we started validating. We did this for Pakistan, then we did it for Rwanda as well.
Thank you, Ryan.
Yes?
Thank you. Thank you for the talk, Thomas and Heap.
at the development seat, we use quite a lot of like open source maps and also like satellite image and trying to map the road network. So I'm just like curious if we have like road network here, and probably it's going to be useful for census data because, for example, doesn't matter like if the road networks like being built up, and especially for road networks like really high density, it probably is going to be useful either for current periods of time or in the future. Like that is going to good to predict the population or human characteristics. I don't know. It's just, yeah, an idea.
Yeah, roads are very useful, and I think actually Ryan's model used roads as part of it. At least that's what I was told. But like for South Sudan, one of our problem is there's just not any roads. Yeah, roads are good, and I will use them.
You run into problems in places like Pakistan where there's just no road data.
Yeah.
And so we used VMAP level 0, whatever it was at the point in time.
Yeah.
And it's
Not great.
just doesn't give you enough information. But the satellite data you can extract, and we got very good at pulling out percent impervious surface. And when we worked in the desert, we used Martino's Pantex, because that worked in the desert, whereas the satellite imagery, the Landsat, just doesn't work in the desert because it's built out of the same material. So you can't use the spectral things, and that's why we started using Pantex. I'm stealing his idea.
Adapting.
He adapted, yeah.
That's very good. Yeah, that's bringing me, because we developed Pantex basically 20 years ago. That's maybe to be said. Yeah, so we have one question there, and then...
I'm thinking about countries where there's a lot of, divide the world very crudely.
Thank you. Into countries where there are, effective municipal schemes for issuing construction and demolition permits that will give you databases of buildings. But then there are areas where there is unplanned development, and my question is, in those areas, in my experience, they tend to be extremely high density, and they're probably difficult to differentiate individual properties because of the spatial density. So then what do you do? Do you then have to do kind of a polygonal assessment and then do a kind of families per square meter kind of estimates? How do you deal with these kind of slum-like developments where there are many households and they're more or less contiguous when viewed from above? The roof of one overlays more or less with the roof of another, with perhaps a 3 feet divide between them. How do you handle that kind of? Any thoughts on that?
Well, it's reliant on the accuracy, or the quality, and the detail of the census data, which is used for disaggregation. So, I mean, you could say the same challenge applies to commercial areas or industrial areas, because you can have a very large warehouse or an airport, which maybe a couple people live there, but it's not going to follow the same, if you were to correlate the building surface area to the population density, it would not follow the same pattern as a densely populated area. So if you have if you're working with census data that's not, or that's aggregated to a relatively large scale, then it can be difficult to disaggregate to the correct or to the buildings that are representative of where people are actually living. So that's where it's kind of like well, I'm trying to think of the right analogy here, but really what it comes down to is detailed census data or detailed population data from which it can be disaggregated from.
Yes, it's very interesting. I have just one question. We are already running very late, but it's an interesting discussion, so I take the opportunity to ask one question. The question is about the data sharing policies of the product you are producing, and we were describing them. This population grids are something that is made for internal use, what is the sharing policy you have behind? And if this kind of output could be shareable, for example, in the frame of the Human Planet Initiative or GEO or something like that? That's one question. The second question is that it's not a question, it's an offer. And the offer is that basically the GRC, in the frame of the Global Human Settlement Layer project, we aim also to produce tools, and in particular we produce tools working with the Sentinel data. So the offer is that are you, let's say, would be you interested to test those tools in your frame and see if they are useful for your purpose? There are tools aiming to collect settlements or built-up areas and things like that. In the case of Sentinel, we detect also more things like open space, green space, other beautiful things. But the point is that, so it's an offer, and to see, would you be interested to, those are free tools, so there is no license there, and they are deployable in the clusters as a runtime.
We've already planned on going.
Yes, from a data sharing perspective, the demo-based data sets are on our website, and that's the goal, is to make them publicly available. And then from a tools perspective, we're agnostic. So whatever tool accomplishes the job, we are enthusiastic to use. So part of our objective is to do a thorough assessment of what's out there.
Later on that.
Yes.
Yeah. Good. So I would like to ask Luis Distra for the closing talk about the global spatial baseline data supporting standardization and about the global people-based definition of cities and settlement from Director of Regional Development of European Commission.
Great. Nice thing about a presentation is you can shake off your jet lag. You can't fall asleep because you're standing up. So it's perfect timing for me. I'll be very brief, but it's a topic I actually feel very strongly about. If I were to summarize what the new UN Sustainable Development Goals do, and especially SDG 11, but not only, they create goals for cities, but not a definition of what a city is. Now, if you look at those goals, a lot of them are extremely sensitive to where you draw that boundary. So if you want your city to do well on a particular indicator, you can fiddle with your boundary such that you game the system. You get a fabulous score. So if you want a lot of open space, you probably want to go for a nice wide boundary. You'll find lots of open spaces on the fringe. If you don't like air pollution, again, big boundary. It's better at the fringes, so your scores will improve. Access to public transport, that's a tougher one. You probably want to have a tight boundary just around your CBD or your city center, and man, you're going to score. Population change, land use change, you can actually pick if you want your city to grow or shrink. Most cities, although not all, as Paulo showed, tend to grow at the edge and tend to lose some population in the center. So if you want to be a shrinking city, just take a tight boundary. If you want to be a growing city, well, just make a broad boundary. So really you can pick. Traffic fatalities also typically requires high-speed traffic. So if you don't want to have high-speed traffic, you focus on the most congested bit. Okay, it's a bit polluted, but the number of fatalities per capita are going to drop. So you can game the system very easily. The difficulty is most people aren't gaming the system on purpose, but it happens anyway. The numbers change dramatically from where you draw the boundary. And so I'm an urban planner by training. I'm not a remote sensor. Martino tries to explain these things to me, and I nod politely, but that's about it. Planning comes almost from a narrative tradition. We have lots of these terms, urban area, we argue about what it exactly means, but we don't have a tight definition about it. So when you compare city to city, you're going to have all these biases, which are probably bigger than the variation that you could actually detect if we have the same definition. So you can't really learn anything from those comparisons, or very little. So the essential question that you need to answer to have comparable data about cities is, where does my city stop? And what we did here is we have 3 examples, Brussels, Dublin, and Malmö. And the kind of dark green is what we defined together with the OECD as a urban core, urban center, high density cluster, high density center. We have lots of names for it, it's always the same thing. But the orange line is the administrative boundary. And so in Brussels, we have a pretty good match on the left-hand side. It's not perfect, but it could be worse.
Dublin, the city, the municipality, is way too small. Half the population in that cluster lives outside the border, so you need another boundary to really capture that. And in Malmö, actually, the boundary captures much more than just that city center. So even, well, made the first point already, so that you need this definition to make meaningful comparisons, but also a simple question, like how many cities are there in South Africa? Well, again, it's not just about where you draw the boundary, it's also how you define what is a city. You know, if you have a fairly expansive definition, you can have lots of cities. We had a discussion with Lithuania, and we found 4 cities, and they said, well, we have 80. So there's clearly something wrong. I don't know if you've ever been to Lithuania. It's a country of about 3 million inhabitants. I don't think it has 80 cities. The Netherlands always claims it has something like 40 large cities, and I think we disagree on what large means. So it is important to have, you know, the same method to identify those things. One last question, for example, what are the 2 biggest cities in Europe? Anybody know? In the EU, but Istanbul and Moscow are actually bigger than both. But the reason that we're working on this also with the bank is actually if you want to know where to put your money, where you put your investments in infrastructure, what you want to do for your development strategies, it's very important to know how urbanized you are. We've all heard the figures, you know, the globe is 50% urban, urbanization is going rapidly. If you actually look what that's based on, it is purely an amalgamation of very poorly constructed data. For half of the countries, we know there is a definition. We don't know when it was last applied. For the other half of the countries, we don't even know if there is a definition, or if it's just a list of places that they like or they tend to think of as a city most of the time. So to use all that information, which comes from such heterogeneous sources, to inform our policy, our lending, our investments, I think is really very dangerous. So last year, we committed to start working on this, the EU, FAO, OECD, World Bank, and we want to finish this work fairly quickly, so by 2019. And we're testing 2 methods, the one that Paolo already described, the EU OECD, functional urban area definition, and the degree of urbanization. Now, the degree of urbanization hasn't been applied to all OECD countries yet, which is why we're also talking to the Census Bureau tomorrow. These 2 definitions are linked. They're applied at the municipal level, but they have a common component. The city is defined in the identical manner. So the core city that he was referring to is joint in 2 definitions. The functional urban area has this commuter belt around it, but we don't define the rest of the country. It's just kind of, you know, a leftover, which is a bit tricky. The other one has 3 classes. UN typically only asks for urban and rural. We go for cities, towns and suburbs, and rural areas. And let me quickly explain you how. So one of the big problems when you're trying to define, characterize a municipality is that they vary tremendously in size and shape, which makes it very difficult to compare them or to define them in a uniform manner. It's much easier if you have a uniform shape, and therefore I like the grid a lot. It's very useful. So we start from this population grid. We create 3 grid concepts, which we then translate into 3 types of municipalities. It's relatively straightforward. I'm very happy about that. I like simple things because I can explain them to my hierarchy. I mean, I don't understand what Martino does, but my hierarchy barely understands what I do. So, you know, you've got this kind of chain. You've got to be quite careful in that. So what's an urban center or a high-density cluster? You get contiguous cells of a density of 1,500 inhabitants per square kilometer. And then all those contiguous cells together have to have 50,000 inhabitants. You don't have 50,000 inhabitants, you don't have an urban center. The urban clusters, kind of the second level, again, contiguous cells, but the minimum density is 300, and the minimum total population in all those contiguous cells is 5,000. This was roughly inspired by some of the thresholds used by different countries to define urban and rural areas. And so rural grid cells are the cells with a density below 300 inhabitants per square kilometers, and the other cells outside urban clusters. How do you translate that into municipalities? Just purely on what the majority of their population is. Majority is an urban center, you're a city.
Majority, you're in an urban cluster, but you're not a city, then you're a town or a suburb. Majority in rural, you're rural. In Europe, we agreed that urban areas, we already discussed this slippery topic, would equal cities and towns and suburbs. And if you do that, the average result for the EU resemble quite a lot what we tell the UN based on national definitions. But if you go to other places, some countries and languages and cultures feel quite strongly that those towns are really quite rural and shouldn't be considered urban. We had a discussion with Egypt, and their definition of a city has 6 different criteria, and it starts with having at least 100,000 population. So there are quite a big differences. I think Denmark has a definition where you just need 200 people to have an urban area. So the perceptions of that change. So just a few maps. This is Cork in Ireland, and you can see the Cork of the center right there, and you can see some smaller outlying settlements, some towns, and then some suburban fringes. We translate that into the grid. So in the red, you see the urban center. Yellow, you see the urban clusters. And the others are the rural cells. And this is how we translate it into the municipalities. So far, so good. With the help of Martino, we applied this to the globe. So we started from the grid that Martino and his team created by combining the data from CISN with the Landsat GHSL built-up area detection, apply the degree of urbanization just to the grid, not to the municipalities, and identified 10,000 cities. And to my knowledge, this is the only time that anybody managed to define cities in a uniform manner, starting from building blocks which have the identical size, these squares. So I think it's a very important step forward. Now this commitment to develop this means that, of course, there's more work to be done. I mean, we've tested this definition, but we need to investigate what different countries and statistical offices think about this. So we have 3 strands of work I want to tell you a little bit about. The first one is a survey. We hope that the UN Statistical Division will launch this survey of a selection of national statistical institutes in the coming weeks. I'll tell you a little bit about the pilot projects where we work with individual countries and some changes that we want to make to the methodology. Looking at the pilot projects, on the left-hand side, you have the pilot projects where we are very engaged. The work is ongoing. South Africa is almost done. It was presented at the UN Statistical Commission in March, and we got a big endorsement that the degree of urbanization produced very meaningful results also in South Africa. I have to say, when we started on this work, I was terribly worried that the principle was good, but all the parameters would have to change because it would never work in less developed countries. But so far, that fear has actually not come to fruition. We also work with Australia and the US because they have this functional urban area definition already applied, but not yet the degree of urbanization. So we're looking at how these rural areas compare to their rural areas, and that's an ongoing discussion, quite interesting. The other list is the potential pilot projects. These are countries which we have approached or will approach to see if they want to participate in a pilot. Actually, we've approached all of these. We'll see how interested they are, how quickly we can come to an active discussion. One of the things that I do want to draw your attention to, if you're curious to see what the degree of urbanization looks like and how it's changed over the past 40 years for any country in the world, click on that link, and courtesy of the Joint Research Center, you can download a little fact sheet with a map of the country, of the capital, and all the data of how that has changed over time and a list of the main cities. I think especially for, if you want to get a snapshot of what this would look like, an excellent little tool there. And this is also how we have engaged with various partners. So, when I try and convince Australia or the Census Bureau to look at this, I'm like, hey, look at this fact sheet. Isn't this interesting? And sometimes they say yes, which is great. The methodological refinements that we want to look at are a couple. First, for the degree of urbanization, we're working with the FAO. They're very interested in this work, and they want to see whether we can look at those rural areas and split it out into 3 different types. The uninhabited areas is probably the most obvious one. If you have a grid cell with nobody in it, guess what? The other one is a little bit more complicated. So we have large rural areas, and sometimes you have fairly concentrated settlements, say called villages or hamlets, and sometimes you have more dispersed settlements. So over the next year or so, we're going to be testing various thresholds and methods to actually identify these smaller places. Right now, we're working with a grid of 1 kilometer. We're likely going to check and see if we can do it with 250 meters to really find those smaller settlements. This middle category, the towns and suburbs, are inherently ambiguous. You have sometimes a small market town in a rural area, sometimes you have a suburban fringe of a very large city, and yet they're kind of clumped together in this one class. Again, many people have asked us, well, okay, you've defined all the cities over 50,000 in Europe, we found about 800 of them. What about the smaller ones? What about these towns? We've tested one method with colleagues in the JRC where we found about 8,000 towns between 5 and 50,000. So, the problem is that the further you move down the urban hierarchy, the bigger the numbers become. So, the equivalent at the globe would mean that if we have 10,000 cities, we might have 100,000 towns or even more. So that makes it a little bit more tricky to manage if you want to visually inspect them. So that's the second refinement that we're looking at. And again, we'll probably try and test whether we can do this with a higher resolution grid. And then the last one on the degree of urbanization, although that one's also linked to the functional urban area definition, is that sometimes we get an urban center which is too big to really be a daily urban system. Let me give you one example here. This is Guangzhou. It goes all the way to Shenzhen. I mean, if you look at the scale of this place, to get from one end of that urban center to the other, you're looking at more than 100 kilometers. I don't think this is a daily urban system. Visually, you can already see, you could chop it into two more manageable bits, and you would probably want to look and see if there's any kind of sub-centers there. You might want to chop it into more than 2 bits. So we're going to see if the data allows us to split this up into more likely cores of a daily urban system. In some situations it may be hard, but this is something we're still trying to do. Then the last thing is about data availability. So we've got this wonderful definition we've been using for 6 years now in the OECD and the EU, but it relies on commuting data. We hope that the census asks these questions, but in many cases it doesn't. And so lots of the countries we've been working with don't have commuting data. Now, on the one hand, we're experimenting a little bit to see if mobile phone data could replace that commuting data, capturing flows of people, all people, rather than just people who are working. But that's not going to provide a global solution anytime soon. So with the World Bank, we're testing whether we can come up with driving time buffers around our 10,000 cities to estimate the commuting zone. And this would be based on the size of your urban center and the GDP per capita of the country. The quality and the density of the road network would already be reflected in the fact that we use driving time, not driving distance. So these 3 factors should allow us to give us a rough proxy of how far the daily economic system of that city extends. I also wanted to emphasize one thing, and I really find this rather impressive. So we approved the UN Sustainable Development Goals. One of them, Chris already alluded to it, the population change versus the land use change was in there. Quite tough indicator, not so clear, no definition of a city. But today, the JRC published a database where you can click on any city and get the population, the built-up area, on a harmonized definition for today and going back 40 years in time. So that's 3 data points for 10,000 cities for 40 years. Bang. And for me, that kind of encapsulates the power of geospatial data, of Earth observation, that you can jump to such rapid
implementation of a new indicator, and so that you can look at it, what it would look like, and so the discussion instantly becomes far more informed. So I find that incredibly impressive and useful. So, wrapping up, I think the global definition is filling an important void. We have lots of definitions, we have lots of terms, but many of them are not easy to replicate. People want urban services, people want multiple functions, but all that data is not available globally in a harmonized way. So I think we need to have a simple, clear definition that seems to work in most of the countries. The methods that we're working with the OECD, functional urban areas, degree of urbanization, seem to be very promising. Areas where I would expect very extreme results have not been able to, well, have shown to be fairly promising. And then the last point, I think the Earth observation data allows us to play much faster and much more reliable with a global coverage than we could if we had to wait for the next census round and the next GIS boundaries. And the fact that we can then harmonize all the different scales of data that we have to a simple grid, I think is also a very powerful tool. So that was my presentation. Thank you very much.
Very good, Lois. You were answering all my questions, so I don't have any question. But I don't know, in the floor, yes, the lady behind. Lady first. Yeah,
Where's
you.
the microphone?
The microphone. I lost the microphone. It's there. Yeah.
Okay. Hi, Louis. This is amazing work. I love what you're doing with the degree of urbanization. I have two quick questions. One is a clarification. You showed the global map and said, we've now done this for the globe, but then you gave a list of, now we're working with these countries. So could you just talk about, you've done this for the globe with the whole global data set, I'm assuming, but then are you actually just trying to do refinements with those countries?
So in the pilots, we try and do a couple of things. For me, the main goal is to get from the grid level to an administrative level. Because for me, the storyline about getting an administrative level classified is it allows you to data match. You have a household survey, you have administrative data, you have population registers. You rarely have them for the grid. They typically are connected to some kind of administrative area. But we don't have a global boundary set of administrative areas at the local level. So when we go talk to countries, we ask them, okay, do you have a municipal boundary set? Or do you have an enumeration boundary set that we can use or that you can use to match? So here, this is still at the grid level. In the pilots, we translate it to their administrative areas. So that's the main goal. The other two things we do is we check for better data. So for example, in the South Africa case, we use better satellite imagery, we use better population data from their census. And then the last thing we do is we compare the degree of urbanization with their national definitions to see, are we way off? Not wanting, of course, to purely replicate, but I find it interesting to see what are the overlaps at the two extremes. Do they use 2 classes, 3 classes? And it helps you to kind of get a sense of how different it really is. And it informs the discussion. And then lastly, we ask them to give us a qualitative judgment on, is this making your country look too urban? Are your cities too big? Are they too small compared to what you would expect? And that then we try and summarize once we have a number of pilots. Did that answer your question?
It does. It does lead me to my next question, which is just thinking then about your 1 kilometer population grid, because there are now several population grids out there, and a lot of times the population geospatial data sets that are at these gridded levels are subject to the exact problems that you mentioned in the beginning for some countries, which is they're very coarse, they don't have a level of detail, people have used different definitions, and all of that gets propagated into the data then that you're using. So my question for you is, have you looked at using different population grids and how that changes your results?
That's a very good question. We have actually looked at different sources. So we have, for example, compared the output of GHS POP with, say, a land scan. We haven't tried it with many other population grids. In the end, because
I find it a quite confusing exercise since it's not a validation exercise. It's not like, you know, if I look at 5 different population grids and I get 5 different results, I don't get any closer to what I need to know. So it's you know, different methods produce different disaggregations, especially where population data is coarse. But I knew that before I went into it. So I don't find that informative. I do find it interesting to look a little bit at how well this disaggregation works when you can confront it with, say, bottom-up data. If you have a grid which is point-based produced by the statistical office. So we could compare, for example, what the various grids look like. But I mean, in the end, for me, the Achilles heel is not the detection of built up and what sensor we use. The real Achilles heel is, do we get good population data? I mean, with the U.S. Census, most of the units are so small, to create a kilometer grid, we don't need to disaggregate, we need to aggregate. So, you know, your margin of error is there very, very tiny. So, long story short, it does have an influence, especially where your units of population data are very large, but it's not very clear which one of them is more valid than another. What I love about GHS POP is, again, it's incredible simplicity. You know, it's just a proportional distribution of the population according to the built-up area. We are going to investigate whether we want to change that assumption, whether we want to have kind of a multi-scalar approach. And if you have very heavily built-up pixels surrounded by a lot of heavily built-up pixels, well, it's likely that the density is going to be a bit higher than if it were surrounded by a whole bunch of nothing. So we'll look into that. If we have enough other data to validate that approach too, we could shift to that. But for the time being, for me, this is a test. It's a simple test with a simple method, but which allows us to engage with the countries to say, okay, this is what we used. If you have better data, tell us, share it, you know, or do it yourself, and then we see how we can go forward.
Can I make a comment on this too? Yeah. So, you know, I think one thing we want to try to unpack in Human Planet and the POP grid activities are exactly these issues, but unpack them. So if the issue is how good is the best available census data, you know, it's modeled in the sense that, you know, like in gridded population of the world, we're adjusting to a year, and so we have a POP simple model to get the census and so forth to a common year, but we're not modeling the spatial distribution except by combining it with those. And of course, obviously, with the other products that are already spatially modeled and adding that to another distribution data set, you're really not unpacking, you're confusing the issue. And so, you know, I think we want to work on these problems as a community as best we can in kind of a systematic way. And we can work on underlying population data and try to even move beyond censuses. I mean, there's some possibilities of working with new censuses where all the households will be georeferenced in high resolution, and that'll give us validation tests that we could potentially work on, and that'll inform that problem. But then there's just separate issues of how best to move people around in order to, for example, look at this urban definition issue.
The Netherlands can produce a 100-meter grid updated weekly because they have their entire population registered, geocoded, and everybody has to register whenever they move. And it's live, so they can update it whenever they want. I've encouraged them not to update the degree of urbanization on a weekly basis. Thank you very much. Chris.
Yeah. So thanks. First of all, it was always nice to see you talking. Well, 3 comments. First one, I will not dive into it, but I think that the choice of population data actually has an immense impact on your output, especially in the degree of uncertainty that you add to your model. But I mean, the different story. Comment on the addressing rural areas. I find it I'm really happy to see that you finally address rural areas. I've been advocating that for the past 5 years, and other than me at that time at the World Bank, nobody did it. I think it's crucial and it sounds good. A comment on your 1 kilometer grid cell. So what we found at that time working in Central America was that 500 meters seems to be a good grid cell size because of the contiguity of cells. You know, they grow together too much for a 1 kilometer grid, and 250 actually was too small. So 500 seemed to be the best. Anyway, I mean, test it out yourself. So the rural area was one thing. The other one was, I have always my issue with the strict and static thresholds applied to a global perspective. And I know we've had this discussion many times, but after all, you developed your method in an OECD context. And okay, now you're extrapolating it. But eventually what you are coming up with, you will tell the Caribbean islands that they have not a single city. It will probably be because they all fall below the thresholds often. If you always have your 5,000 threshold, your 50,000 threshold, and so on, and you apply it uniformly, that will be a problem. So I understand the globally consistent aim, and it's a good aim, and I would argue that methodologically it's good, but probably you should not stick to the static numbers at the global scale. But I know I will not find any open ears on that, but I will keep telling it.
So we have an ongoing conversation that we hold in public. Let me respond to a few things. I'll leave the population source aside for the time being. On the resolution of the grid, we used 1 kilometer because when we were in discussion with the national statistical offices, quite a few of them were unwilling to go further in terms of resolution. And this is also compounded by the fact that we're now investigating whether they can provide more than just total population, but also disaggregations by, splits by age, by sex, and maybe even employment. On our experience with using finer grids, Martino also applied the degree of urbanization at 250 meters. There are places where it works better, like Cairo. There are places where it works worse, like Atlanta. Because basically, you need to try and find a balance between what works in different places. And so when you start playing with that resolution, you start seeing these really large places like Guangzhou, okay, then you get separate centers. But then what is in fact a single center like Atlanta, fragments into 20 cities, which it's not. So it's difficult to find that right balance. We're going to take a look whether we can find some kind of generalization method which would allow us to move to a higher resolution without overly fragmenting centers which are intrinsically united. On the rural, I'm totally with you. I've always wanted to do this. I think it's interesting, and I'm increasingly confident that we can do this. The only reason I hesitated is that the area where I think the population data matters most is not for the cities. We all know where they are. The 10,000 cities, most countries, you look at the list, okay, yeah, you got most of them, or maybe they miss a few, but they recognize all these places. It's for the distinction between rural and this towns and suburbs where how you spread it out matters a lot. So I think methodologically we can do it, but I think in terms of data quality, it's harder. See, I cheated. I kept some stuff of my presentation in the back, and I wanted to show you this one. So for this State of European Cities report, we analyzed the median density of these urban centers. I call them cities here just for convenience sake. And so they're grouped by continent, and they're grouped by size. The darker the size, the darker the color, the bigger the size. So the dark bars are all the cities over 5 million. Yeah? And we use the same density threshold. If I start using a different density threshold, say in North America, or I make it a bit lower, I increase it in Asia, I can forget this comparison. It instantly becomes meaningless because I select the way I select the cells is different. So the output will be utterly different. And so this comparison I can only do if I keep at least the density threshold fixed. The total population threshold is less sensitive and less distortionary, but also in most cases it doesn't change that much. You know, if you go from 50 to 20, for 50,000 to 25,000, it's not going to alter your main numbers as such. We actually think most places have a city of 50,000. It'd be, you know, you have to be really, really small not to have one of those. So I'm less concerned about countries saying like, hey, I do have a city, but I'll stop there.
Should I comment again?
I love your conversation. Yes.
No, you know, I mean, I totally get it. You're right. If you change the thresholds, you can't compare. But I don't think we should compare just for the sake of comparing. You know, there is a value in comparison, but urban areas are simply different in Asia than in Central America and in Europe and in Southern Africa. I think that, you know, we should understand the concept of urban and try to define the concept of urban, but we cannot do that with a uniform threshold. But anyway, I mean, I still agree that it has value. It has a lot of value in terms of communicating and so. But I would argue it actually can also lead to miscommunication, and that's what always I'm saying, because simply the urban areas are different. We don't compare surface water, you know, from Asia to North America, which might be relatively similar. We compare the formation of human activity into an urban space that is different in China than in, you know, Uruguay. Sorry.
I never intended this definition to replace national definitions. I think national definitions will always play a role, and they will always exist. And I think that they're perfectly appropriate to capture the specificity of their cities in whatever way they see appropriate. But this definition also has a political message. It says, this area is dense, is it contiguous? If you want to manage your city, you should at least cover that by a single body. When we go to the commuting zone, we say, okay, if you want to manage transport, land use, you should have one body covering all of this area. And basically what you're saying is, yeah, but that area can be a lot smaller in some countries, and it can be a lot bigger in another country. And I still struggle to see the logic of that story. But well, I suggest we stop our dialogue and then we open it up to a wider audience.
I didn't connect it like that at all. I connected in terms of those services that you talked about being connected through other cities that are providing those services and those critical functions.
Yeah.
It's connecting the urban areas to the global hinterlands that creates that abstraction, you know, in some ways. And so the notion that all those services are going to be coming in from that core is not applicable anymore.
No.
That was Greece in like 1200 BC.
When everybody walked.
Yeah.
Okay, so I think it's evident that urban and human settlements, you know, collect the most complexity and the most economical interest, conflicting, ideological, symbolical dimensions. And so it's not a surprise that we don't all agree about what we are talking about. But I think it's also a good closure of this session because it demonstrates the complexity of the issues and demonstrate, I think, very well the role of remote sensing and, let's say, standardized data on that, on try to at least explore alternative way to define the reality, and let's say you can explore and comparing them with a fair, homogeneous background. That's already, I don't know, now I'm speaking maybe on behalf of Louis, but I think to have a common background, it's helping the discussion. So if you have a conflict on definition, I mean, to have a general baseline data that can support different tests and hypotheses, I think it's, at least my opinion is that it's helping to converge, and that's maybe one role of remote sensing that it should be important for Geo, so we should maybe talk more on that. I don't know if this is, I don't know if you have a closing remark, Bob. But this will be my closing remark. Let's say.
Great. Well, I would just close and say, you know, these are the issues that we want to address in this GEO initiative, that, you know, it is important to have the dialogue, to think about how evidence can be used to, you know, compare and test and contrast, because that is going to support decision-making as well as science. And I think that's why we want everybody and more people to participate and contribute from both the producer and the user end, and that, you know, I think as we proceed with this from plenary to plenary and so forth, hopefully we'll, you know, we'll see a lot more data and tools and maybe convergence on some of these issues. So I think that's the kind of discussion we have had today and want to have in the future.
Thank you, Bob. So I think it's time to thank you very much for attending to this long session, and see you soon in other places, maybe to see interesting results and next challenge. So thank you very much.